Power in Valterra wasn't measured in crowns or territories. It was measured in silence. The kind of silence that fell over a room when Duke Caedric Ashford walked through it. Men who commanded armies suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Women who traded secrets at court parties found their tongues frozen mid-sentence. Even the king himself shifted uncomfortably on his gilded throne whenever Ashford's shadow crossed the palace halls. They called him the Iron Duke, the Wolf of the North, the man who turned rebellion into ash and mercy into myth. But those were just titles people whispered to make themselves feel safer. The truth was simpler and infinitely more terrifying. Caedric Ashford didn't just rule the northern provinces, he owned them the way winter owns the mountains. Completely, ruthlessly, without apology. And tonight, in the smoke-choked ruins of what used to be the merchants' quarter, surrounded by bodies and broken glass and the acrid stench of gunpowder, he was about to remind everyone exactly why fear was the only currency that mattered. Stay with me, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the terrible price of loving a man who has forgotten how to be human. The fire had been burning for 3 hours before Caedric arrived. Orange flames chewed through timber frames and silk banners, while black smoke rolled across cobblestone streets like fog made of poison. Merchants screamed from upper windows. Children wailed in their mothers' arms. The city watch ran in circles, spraying water from hand pumps that barely slowed the inferno, consuming entire blocks. Caedric sat motionless on his black warhorse at the edge of the destruction, watching the chaos with the same expression he wore during military strategy sessions. Calculating, cold. His dark coat barely moved despite the wind carrying embers through the night air like dying stars. Captain Graves rode up beside him, soot streaking his weathered face. "Your Grace," the fire started in 3 locations simultaneously. Deliberate, professional. Caedric didn't look away from the flames. Survivors? Maybe 200 dead already. Mostly commoners. Some lower nobility caught in the... I asked about survivors who matter. Graves swallowed hard. Lord Brennan's daughter was hosting a charity gala in the textile district. We haven't confirmed her location. Something flickered across Caedric's face. Not quite emotion, flickered across. More like the memory of what emotion used to feel like. Find her. Sir, the structural integrity is... I didn't ask for an engineering report, Captain. I gave you an order. Graves nodded once and spurred his horse toward the flames. Caedric remained perfectly still as the world burned in front of him. Behind him, a dozen of his personal guard sat mounted and silent, waiting for commands that would inevitably come. They'd learned long ago that the Duke never wasted movement, never spoke unless words carried weight, never showed his hand until the game was already won. A young lieutenant approached nervously from the left flank. "Your Grace, Magistrate Hollis requests your presence at the Emergency Council. They're assembling at..." "No." The lieutenant blinked. "Sir, tell Hollis that if he had done his job properly, half the city wouldn't be burning. Tell him that I'll attend his council meeting when I'm finished investigating why his security failed so catastrophically. And tell him that if he interrupts me again tonight, I'll investigate him personally." The lieutenant paled and retreated immediately. Caedric dismounted with fluid precision, his boots hitting cobblestone with the kind of deliberate weight that made nearby soldiers straighten reflexively. He walked toward the burning district with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the pattern of destruction the way other men studied paintings in museums. 3 ignition points, coordinated timing, maximum civilian casualties during evening market hours when crowds were densest. This wasn't random violence, this was theater. Someone wanted him to see this, wanted him to react, and they clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. A figure stumbled from the smoke ahead, an older woman clutching a child, both of them coughing violently. Caedric stepped aside without breaking stride, letting one of his guards intercept them and direct them toward the evacuation routes. He had neither the time nor the inclination for individual heroics. Sentiment was luxury. Survival was mathematics. "Your Grace, the voice came from his right. Major Thorne, his chief intelligence officer, emerged from the chaos with that perpetual expression of controlled urgency that made him valuable. "Report," Caedric said. 3 confirmed accelerants used. Military grade. Black market sourcing likely from the eastern cartels. Witnesses describe 4 individuals fleeing north immediately after ignition. Two matched descriptions from the Harbor District bombing last month. It's Kedrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Radicals? That's the assumption. Anti-nobility rhetoric has been escalating in the lower districts for weeks. Pamphlets calling for redistribution of wealth, speeches about equality and justice, the usual revolutionary theater. And you're only telling me this now? Thorne's expression didn't change. I reported the unrest in last week's briefing. You said it wasn't worth attention until they moved beyond words. They've moved beyond words, Major. 200 corpses is considerably beyond words. Yes, sir. Kedrick turned back toward the flames, his mind already dissecting possibilities. Radicals were predictable, desperate, idealistic to the point of stupidity. They burned things because destruction felt like progress when you had nothing left to lose. But this level of coordination suggested organization. Funding. Someone pulling strings behind the revolutionary slogans. Someone who wanted chaos. Double the patrols in every working-class district. Institute a curfew starting tomorrow. Anyone caught outside after dark gets detained for questioning. No exceptions. Thorne hesitated. Your Grace, a blanket curfew will inflame tensions. The lower classes already believe I don't care what they believe, Major. I care about preventing the next massacre. If that requires treating every citizen like a potential terrorist until we identify the actual terrorists, then that's what we'll do. Stability through strength. Order through fear. It's worked for 5 years. It'll work now. And if it pushes more people toward radicalization? Kedrick finally looked at him directly. His eyes were the color of slate in winter. Hard. Reflective. Utterly devoid of mercy. Then we'll have clearer targets. Thorne nodded slowly and moved to relay the orders. Kedrick continued walking through the destruction, his mind cataloging details that others missed. The spacing between collapsed buildings. The locations where fire spread fastest versus where it stalled. The types of structures targeted versus those left standing. Someone had studied the district's architecture carefully, knew which buildings would create fire breaks, which alleys would funnel flames toward maximum destruction. This wasn't amateur hour. This was war. And Kedrick had learned long ago that war required only one rule: win first, justify later. A woman's scream cut through the ambient noise of crackling flames and shouted orders. Kedrick's head snapped toward the sound with predatory focus. 40 meters ahead, a building groaned as its second floor collapsed inward, sending a cascade of burning timber onto the street below. In the momentary gap between walls, he saw her. Not Lord Brennan's daughter, someone else entirely. A girl in servant's clothes pinned beneath fallen debris, flames inching closer across oil-soaked floorboards. Her face was streaked with ash and blood, her eyes wide with the kind of animal terror that came from watching death approach slowly. Kedrick calculated the odds instantly. Structural instability made rescue attempt high risk. The girl was clearly lowborn, economically replaceable. Time invested in saving her would delay his investigation of the larger attack. Logical choice. Continue forward. He moved toward her instead. Later, he would tell himself it was about optics, about demonstrating strength and decisiveness in crisis, about proving to witnesses that their duke didn't abandon subjects even in catastrophe. But in the moment, as he grabbed a discarded fire axe and started chopping through the burning beam pinning the girl's legs, he didn't think at all. He just moved. Wood splintered under repeated strikes. Smoke burned his lungs. Heat blistered his hands through leather gloves. The building groaned again, more urgently this time, as support structures failed one after another. Somewhere behind him, his guards were shouting warnings about imminent collapse. Kedrick ignored them completely. The beam broke free. He grabbed the girl under her arms and dragged her clear of the debris with seconds to spare before the entire facade came crashing down in an explosion of sparks and ash. He dropped her onto cobblestone away from the flames and stepped back immediately, brushing embers from his coat with clinical efficiency. The girl lay coughing violently, staring up at him with confusion and gratitude and something that looked almost like worship. Kedrick felt nothing in response. "Get her to the medical station," he told the nearest guard. "Then forget this happened." The guard saluted and moved to comply. Kedrick turned away before the girl could thank him, already refocusing on the larger tactical picture. Saving one servant didn't change anything. didn't make him noble or heroic or redeemed. It was simply pragmatic risk management. Dead citizens created resentment. Rescued citizens created loyalty. Everything was currency. Everything had value that could be spent later. That was the mathematics of power. The emergency council convened 2 hours before dawn in the vaulted stone chamber beneath the palace's east wing. Magistrate Hollis sat at the head of the table, looking exactly like a man who'd spent the night preparing excuses. Around him, 24 officials and nobles argued in overlapping voices about jurisdiction and responsibility, and whose failure was least blameworthy. Cedric entered without knocking. The room fell silent instantly, as if someone had physically removed all the air. He walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table, his footsteps echoing against marble floors with metronomic precision. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Hollis seemed frozen mid-gesture, his hand suspended in the air like he'd forgotten it existed. Cedric sat down slowly, arranging his coat with deliberate care. Then he looked at Hollis with the expression of a man examining something unfortunate he'd found on his boot. "Continue," Cedric said quietly. Hollis cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace, we were just discussing the allocation of emergency funds for 247 dead," Cedric interrupted. 419 wounded, approximately 6 million in property damage. 3 confirmed accelerants traced to Eastern cartel suppliers. 4 suspects fleeing north toward the industrial quarter. And your response so far has been to convene a committee to discuss funding allocation. Hollis's face reddened. "With respect, Your Grace, there are protocols for..." "Protocols." Cedric leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Magistrate, which protocol specifically covers the systematic failure of your intelligence network to identify a coordinated terrorist cell operating inside our city for what appears to be months?" "We had no credible intelligence suggesting..." "You had riots in the Harbor District, seditious pamphlets circulating through worker neighborhoods, public speeches calling for violent overthrow of the nobility, and your assessment was that none of this warranted serious attention. The Crown's advisors determined that heavy-handed suppression would..." "The Crown's advisors," Cedric said slowly, "are politicians concerned with popularity. I'm concerned with survival. Guess which concern actually keeps people alive?" Lord Pemberton, a portly baron who controlled most of the city's textile production, leaned forward with forced confidence. "Your Grace, while we all respect your military expertise, perhaps domestic policy requires a more nuanced approach than battlefield tactics." Cedric looked at him with the kind of attention a biologist might give an interesting specimen of parasite. "Tell me, Lord Pemberton, how many of your workers died in the fire?" Pemberton blinked. I'm not certain of the exact..." 43, Cedric said. 43 people who worked in your factories, lived in your housing blocks, bought from your shops, your workers whose taxes fund your lifestyle and whose labor generates your wealth. And you can't even remember their names long enough to count the bodies. That's hardly fair. Yes, sir. Fair? Cedric's voice remained soft, but somehow became more dangerous. "Lord Pemberton, fairness is a concept invented by people too weak to impose their will directly. You want nuance? Here's nuance. Your district's security was compromised because you cut costs on night patrols to maximize quarterly profits. Those 43 workers died because you valued gold over protection. Us. And now you're sitting here lecturing me about domestic policy while their families bury children. Boss, Pemberton's face went from red to white. You can't possibly suggest that I'm personally responsible for... I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. Your negligence enabled this attack. And if you can't accept that reality, then you're too stupid to be in this room. Someone gasped. Someone else made a choking sound. Nobody actually defended Pemberton. Magistrate Hollis tried to regain control. Your Grace, we're all upset by the tragedy, but turning on each other serves no purpose. We need unity right now. Cooperation. A measured response that, what we need, Cedric interrupted, is blood in the streets. The room froze. Hollis laughed nervously. Surely you're speaking metaphorically. No. Cedric stood slowly, placing both palms flat on the table and leaning forward with the deliberate intensity of a predator selecting prey. I'm speaking tactically. These radicals attacked us because they believed we were weak, soft, vulnerable. They calculated that burning a few hundred commoners would create panic and political paralysis while we debated proper protocols. They were counting on exactly this response. Committees, discussions, measured fucking restraint. And you propose what exactly? Lord Ashton asked carefully. Cadric smiled. It was not a comforting expression. I propose we demonstrate why betting against the nobility is a fatal mistake. I propose we hunt down every individual connected to this attack and execute them publicly in the central square. Not after trials. Not after months of legal theater. Immediately. And then I propose we declare martial law across every district showing signs of radical sympathy, arrest anyone distributing seditious materials, and remind this entire city that order isn't negotiable. Absolute silence. Then Magistrate Hollis found his voice. Your Grace, that would be tyranny. The Crown would never authorize such. The Crown, Cadric said softly, will authorize whatever I tell them to authorize. Or have you forgotten who actually controls the military forces keeping this kingdom intact? The threat hung in the air like smoke. Lord Ashton shifted uncomfortably. Duke Ashford, we all acknowledge your contributions to national security, but threatening the monarchy itself. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining reality. King Julian sits on his throne because my armies patrol his borders. Noble houses maintain their privileges because my intelligence network prevents coups. This city functions because my logistics expertise keeps food shipments arriving and trade routes secure. The entire kingdom runs on infrastructure I built, enforce, and fund. So when I tell you that we need blood in the streets to prevent total collapse, I'm not offering an opinion. I'm describing the only path forward that doesn't end with this entire society burning to ash. There has to be another way, someone whispered. Cadric looked at the speaker with something almost like pity. There isn't. There never is. You can choose strength or weakness, victory or defeat, survival or extinction. Those are the only options history ever offers. Everything else is just comfortable lies people tell themselves before reality comes to collect. He straightened and walked toward the door without waiting for dismissal or response. Your Grace, Hollis called after him desperately. What are you planning to do? Cadric paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe. I'm planning to save this kingdom from itself, whether it wants to be saved or not. Then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his footsteps and the slow realization that something fundamental had just shifted in the balance of power. Dawn broke cold and gray over the industrial quarter, painting factory smokestacks in shades of iron and ash. Cadric stood on the roof of an abandoned textile mill, watching his soldiers move through the streets below like wolves tracking wounded prey. Major Thorne climbed the access ladder and approached carefully. Perimeter is secured, all exits covered. We have positive identification on at least 3 suspects inside the warehouse complex on Merchant Street. Alive? For now, cher. Cadric nodded slowly. I want them taken breathing. I need information more than corpses, but make it clear that resistance will be fatal. No negotiations, no mercy if they fight. And afterward? Public execution at noon, Central Square, maximum visibility. Thorne hesitated. Sir, the magistrate's office is requesting that any captured suspects be transferred to civilian custody for... The magistrate's office can request whatever it wants. The only custody these people are entering is mine. That's technically illegal, Your Grace. Without formal charges and... Major, are you questioning my orders? The question was asked softly, almost gently, which made it infinitely more dangerous. Thorne met his gaze steadily. No, sir. I'm documenting the chain of command for when this becomes politically complicated. Cadric almost smiled. Smart man. Document whatever you need. Just make sure the arrests happen before someone at the palace finds their spine and tries to interfere. Understood. Movement below caught Cadric's attention. His soldiers were breaching the warehouse entrance, moving in tactical formation with military precision. Shouts echoed, glass shattered. Then silence. 5 minutes later, Captain Graves emerged, dragging 3 bound prisoners into the street. 2 men and a woman, all of them young and defiant despite the bruises flowering across their faces. Cadric descended the ladder with controlled efficiency and approached the captives. Up close, they looked exactly like he expected. Early 20s, working-class clothing beneath their burns and blood, eyes burning with the kind of righteous fury that only came from believing your cause justified anything. He'd seen that expression before, usually right before he killed the people wearing it. The woman spat at his feet. "Murderer? Tyrant? You think we're afraid of you?" Kaedric crouched in front of her until their faces were level. "No," he said quietly. "I know you're not afraid. That's your mistake. Fear is what keeps people alive, is what stops them from doing catastrophically stupid things like burning districts full of innocent families. You traded fear for ideology, and now you're going to die for that exchange." "We're fighting for justice," one of the men snarled. "For equality, for nothing." Kaedric stood. "You're fighting because fighting makes you feel important, because destruction is easier than construction, because burning things gives you temporary power in lives that otherwise have none. You're not revolutionaries. You're spoiled children throwing tantrums with explosives." The woman laughed bitterly. "Says the man born into privilege, the great duke who's never struggled, never starved, never watched my entire family executed in front of me before I was 13, Kaedric interrupted. "Never survived 3 years in military prison for crimes I didn't commit? Never built everything I have from absolute nothing through pure fucking will? You don't know anything about my life. You just know the title, the reputation, the myth." That shut her up momentarily. Kaedric gestured to his guards. "Take them to the holding cells beneath the armory. No visitors, no communication. If they so much as look at you wrong, remind them that cooperation is optional, but survival is negotiable." "You can't do this," the woman shouted as guards hauled them away. "The king will hear about—" "The king already knows. He knows everything I choose to tell him, which will be exactly as much as serves my purposes and not one word more." After the prisoners were gone, Major Thorne moved beside him with characteristic caution. "Your Grace, that was the easy part. The court nobles are going to push back hard on summary executions. They'll call it overreach, abuse of power. There'll be formal complaints to the crown. Let them complain. Complaints don't change outcomes. Power does. And if the king sides with them..." Kaedric finally looked at Thorne directly, and something in his expression made the major step back reflexively. "The king won't side against me. Because deep down, Julian knows the same truth everyone else knows. I'm not the hero of this kingdom. I'm not the noble guardian protecting civilization. I'm the necessary evil that keeps the whole rotten structure from collapsing. And you can't remove necessary evils without destroying everything they support. That's a lonely position, sir. Loneliness is irrelevant. Results matter. Stability matters. Everything else is just noise." Thorne nodded slowly and turned to coordinate the tactical withdrawal. Kaedric remained standing in the empty street, watching smoke drift across morning sky like ghosts of everything he'd sacrificed to reach this moment. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and calculation, a small voice whispered that maybe the radicals weren't entirely wrong. Maybe he had become the tyrant everyone feared. Maybe power had consumed whatever humanity he once possessed. He silenced that voice the same way he silenced everything else that interfered with necessity, by refusing to acknowledge it existed. The execution was scheduled for noon in the central square, where 5 major streets converged beneath a bronze statue of King Julian's grandfather. By 11:30, thousands of citizens packed the surrounding blocks, their faces reflecting mixtures of fear, anticipation, and barely concealed rage. Kaedric watched from a balcony overlooking the square, his hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic posture of controlled authority. Below, soldiers formed barriers holding back the crowd, while engineers finished constructing the execution platform. 3 nooses dangled from reinforced beams, swaying slightly in the wind. Lady Evelyn Brennan approached from behind, her footsteps soft against marble flooring. "This is madness," she said without preamble. Kaedric didn't turn. "Good afternoon to you as well, Lady Brennan. Don't deflect with pleasantries. You're about to execute 3 people without trial, without evidence, without even basic legal process. This isn't justice. It's theater. All justice is theater. The difference is whether the performance achieves its purpose." Evelyn moved beside him, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. She was younger than Ceadric by 5 years, but carried herself with the kind of aristocratic confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. Her father controlled the kingdom's largest banking networks, which made her both valuable and dangerous in equal measure. "And what purpose is this achieving exactly?" she demanded. "Besides terrifying your own citizens, preventing the next attack, demonstrating consequences, reminding every potential radical that ideology doesn't stop rope. You're creating martyrs, heroes for their cause. Better dead heroes than living terrorists." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I thought you were smarter than this. Brutality breeds resistance. Fear breeds hatred. You're pouring oil on fires you should be extinguishing." Ceadric finally looked at her. "And what would you suggest, Lady Brennan? More committee meetings? More measured responses? More political theater that changes nothing while people die? I've watched kingdoms fall because their leaders mistook compassion for strength. I've seen civilizations collapse because no one had the stomach to do what survival required. So forgive me if I'm not interested in repeating those mistakes. There has to be a middle ground between tyranny and weakness." No, there really doesn't. That's the comfortable lie moderates tell themselves. In reality, power operates in absolutes. You either impose your will or someone imposes theirs on you. You either control the narrative or the narrative controls you. There is no middle ground. There's only winning and losing. Evelyn stared at him with something between pity and horror. Evelyn stared at... "What happened to you? The man I knew 10 years ago would never..." "The man you knew 10 years ago was naive," Ceadric interrupted coldly. "He believed in honor, in fairness, in the fundamental goodness of human nature. Then reality taught him better. People aren't good, Eveline. They're just afraid of consequences. Remove the fear and they become monsters instantly. So I maintain the fear, carefully, systematically, because it's the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. That's not civilization, that's a prison. What's the difference?" Before Evelyn could respond, bells began tolling across the square. Noon, execution time. Ceadric turned toward the stairs. "You should leave if this offends your sensibilities. I won't force you to witness uncomfortable necessities." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "I'm staying. Someone needs to remember what you're becoming." He paused momentarily, then continued down without acknowledging her statement. The crowd's noise grew louder as Ceadric descended the palace steps and moved through his military escort toward the execution platform. Soldiers lined both sides of his path, their weapons held ready against potential violence. Somewhere in the packed masses, someone shouted, "Murderer!" but the insult was swallowed by ambient noise before it could gain momentum. Ceadric climbed the platform steps and stood before the crowd with perfect composure. Behind him, guards dragged the 3 prisoners forward, forcing them to their knees beneath the waiting nooses. The square fell gradually silent, thousands of eyes fixed on the platform with mixed expressions of terror and fascination. Ceadric didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, and somehow the words carried across the entire space. Last night, 247 people died in fires deliberately set by radical terrorists. Men, women, children. Innocent families burned alive because ideologues decided their cause justified mass murder. These 3 individuals standing behind me participated directly in that attack. They showed no mercy to your neighbors, your friends, your families. They offered no trials, no evidence, no legal process. They simply destroyed lives without hesitation. He paused, letting the statement settle. Now, some of you are thinking this execution is unjust, illegal, tyrannical. You're wondering how I can condemn these people without proper trials or formal investigations. You're questioning whether this is the action of a protector or a dictator. Another pause. The crowd waited in suspended tension, and you're right to question, because I'm not offering you justice today. I'm offering you survival. These executions aren't about law or fairness or moral righteousness. They're about sending one message to every potential terrorist in this kingdom. If you attack us, you die. Not eventually. Not after months of legal proceedings. Immediately. Publicly. Without exception. Someone in the crowd shouted something. Ceadric ignored them. You can hate me for this. You can call me monster, tyrant, whatever helps you sleep at night. But tomorrow morning, when you wake up alive because no one else decided to burn your home for political theater, you'll understand why necessary evils exist. Why some men have to carry darkness so others can pretend the world is light. He turned toward the executioner and nodded once. The trapdoors dropped. 3 bodies fell. 3 ropes snapped taut. Silence consumed the square like a physical force. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, people began dispersing. Some looked satisfied. Others looked horrified. Most looked simply tired. Tired of violence, tired of fear, tired of living in a kingdom that required public executions to maintain basic stability. Kadrick remained on the platform long after the crowd disappeared, staring at the swaying bodies with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Major Thorne approached carefully. "Your Grace, we should relocate to secure facilities. There are unconfirmed reports of sympathizers planning retaliation." "Let them plan," Kadrick said quietly. "Planning means they're thinking instead of acting. Thinking people can be manipulated. It's the ones who act on pure emotion you can't predict. Still, security protocols recommend—" "I'm aware of the protocols, Major. Execute them as you see fit." Thorne saluted and withdrew. Kadrick descended from the platform and walked through the now empty square toward his waiting carriage. His guards formed protective formation around him automatically, their movements synchronized through years of practice. Lady Evelyn was waiting beside the carriage, her face carefully neutral. "Congratulations," she said flatly. "You've successfully terrified an entire city. Terror is temporary, stability is permanent. I'll take the trade. And when the terror stops working, when people become numb to executions and threats, what then?" Kadrick climbed into the carriage without answering. Evelyn followed, sitting across from him as the vehicle began moving through cobblestone streets. "You're going to destroy yourself," she said softly. "Not through violence or rebellion, through isolation. You're building walls so high that eventually no one will be able to reach you at all. Not allies, not friends, no one." "Good," Kadrick replied. "Attachment is vulnerability. Care is weakness. The moment you give people access to your humanity is the moment they gain leverage to destroy you. I learned that lesson thoroughly. I won't forget it. That's not strength, that's cowardice." His eyes snapped toward her with genuine anger for the first time. "You want to lecture me about cowardice? You who've never made a decision more difficult than which dress to wear? You who've never held dying soldiers while they screamed for mothers who couldn't hear them? You who've never been forced to choose between impossible evils because refusing to choose meant everyone dies?" Evelyn met his rage without flinching. "No, you're right. I haven't experienced those things. But I have watched you become exactly what you claim to fight against. The tyrant, the monster, the man who justifies anything through necessity. And the worst part? You don't even see it anymore." The carriage rolled to a stop outside Evelyn's family estate. She moved to the door, then paused and looked back. "I loved who you used to be, Kadrick. That man was worth saving. But I don't know if he exists anymore, or if you finally killed him, along with everything else you've sacrificed." Then she was gone, leaving Kadrick alone in the darkened carriage with only his reflection in polished brass fittings for company. And for just a moment, staring at that reflection, he barely recognized the man looking back. Then he closed his eyes and rebuilt the walls and reminded himself that recognition was irrelevant. Survival was all that mattered. But night fell across the northern provinces like a judgment, painting the Duke's estate in shadows and silver moonlight. Kadrick stood in his private study, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports, tracking radical cells across the kingdom with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey. A knock interrupted his concentration. "Enter. Captain Graves stepped inside, his expression grim. "Your Grace, we have a situation developing in the Eastern Territories. Multiple reports of coordinated uprisings. Burning tax offices. Attacking supply convoys. They're escalating." Kadrick studied the updated map Graves placed before him, his mind already calculating responses and counter-responses 3 moves ahead. Mobilize the 2nd and 5th regiments. Full combat deployment. Crush the uprisings with maximum prejudice. No prisoners unless they have intelligence value. Sir, the Crown is requesting restraint. They're concerned about... The Crown, Kadrick said softly, can be concerned from the safety of their palace while I handle the actual crisis. Move the regiments. Tonight. Graves saluted and left. Alone again, Kadrick poured himself whiskey and stood at the window overlooking his estate grounds. Somewhere in the darkness, revolution was building. Chaos spreading. Everything he'd built through blood and calculation threatening to unravel. And in the center of it all, he stood isolated, feared, powerful, utterly alone. A letter arrived by courier moments later, sealed with black wax bearing the royal crest. Cedric opened it with mounting coldness. Duke Ashford. Recent events have caused significant concern within the Crown's Advisory Council. Your methods, while effective, have generated political complications that threaten stability. We request your presence at the palace tomorrow to discuss alternative approaches to the current crisis. Furthermore, it has come to our attention that Lady Isolde Ravencroft, daughter of Lord Ravencroft and ward of the Crown, will be arriving in your territory next week to assess the humanitarian situation. We trust you will extend her full courtesy and cooperation. By order of King Julian, Cedric read it twice, then set the letter on his desk and smiled without humor. So the king was sending a spy. A beautiful, well-educated spy wrapped in humanitarian concern and noble obligation. Someone to observe him closely, report back, undermine his authority through careful political maneuvering. How predictable. How perfectly, tragically predictable. He walked back to his window and stared into darkness, where revolution gathered strength and his enemies circled like wolves scenting weakness. And Cedric Ashford, the Iron Duke, the man who ruled through fear and calculation and absolute ruthless necessity, realized with sudden terrible clarity that the war wasn't coming. It was already here. And the deadliest enemy wasn't the radicals burning his kingdom. It was the woman he hadn't met yet, who was about to walk straight into the center of his carefully constructed hell and demand he prove there was still something human left to save. The carriage wheels ground against frozen earth as Lady Isolde Ravencroft traveled north through territories that grew progressively darker the closer she came to Duke Ashford's domain. Her companion, an elderly scholar named Thaddeus, who served as her official chaperone, kept glancing nervously at the landscape rolling past their window. Burned villages, empty farmhouses, gallows standing at crossroads like skeletal warnings. This wasn't a province. It was a battlefield pretending to be civilized. Isolde studied the intelligence reports spread across her lap with clinical focus. 23 public executions in the past month. Martial law enforced across 6 districts. Trade routes militarized. Citizens required to carry identification papers at all times. The Duke had essentially transformed the Northern Territories into a prison masquerading as governance, and King Julian wanted her to assess whether this man could be reasoned with or needed to be removed. She already knew the answer. The question was whether she could prove it before Ashford figured out why she was really here. The carriage jolted over rough terrain. Thaddeus cleared his throat nervously. "My lady, perhaps we should reconsider this approach. The Duke's reputation suggests he does not respond well to oversight or criticism. Walking into his fortress and questioning his methods seems as unwise." Isolde didn't look up from her documents. Unwise would be allowing a tyrant to consolidate power while pretending we're monitoring the situation. The king sent me because I'm expendable if things go wrong, but connected enough to matter if I succeed. So either I gather evidence that Ashford has become a threat to the crown, or I don't come back at all. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be, it's meant to be accurate. She finally looked at Thaddeus directly. The old scholar had served her family for decades. He'd taught her languages and philosophy and how to navigate court politics without becoming another decorative noble playing games while the kingdom burned. She trusted him completely, which made what she was about to say harder. "When we arrive, you'll stay with the household staff. You won't attend meetings with the Duke. You won't ask questions or draw attention. Your only job is to survive and carry my final reports back to the capital, if I can't." Thaddeus's weathered face went pale. "You're expecting to die." "I'm expecting possibilities. Death is one of them." "My lady, this isn't a negotiation, Thaddeus. These are instructions. Follow them." The old man nodded slowly, understanding that arguing was pointless once Isolde made decisions. The carriage crested a hill and Ashford's estate came into view below. Isolde had seen castles before, fortresses, military installations. But this was different. The Duke's home looked like violence given architectural form. Black stone walls, guard towers at every corner, soldiers patrolling battlements with military precision. No gardens, no decorative elements, just brutal functionality designed to project power and nothing else. a prison for the man who lived inside it as much as the territories he controlled. The main gates opened as their carriage approached, iron mechanisms grinding with ominous finality. Guards lined both sides of the entrance road, their weapons held ready, despite this being an official crown visit. Nobody was taking chances. Nobody trusted anyone. The carriage stopped in a courtyard, empty of everything except cobblestone and mounting dread. Isolde descended without waiting for assistance, her boots hitting ground with deliberate confidence. She wore traveling clothes rather than formal court attire. Practical. Unadorned. Sending the message that she wasn't here for political theater. A tall officer approached with crisp military bearing, Captain Graves based on the insignia. His face showed the kind of permanent exhaustion that came from serving under command that never rested. Lady Ravencroft, the Duke is expecting you. He requests you join him in his study immediately. Not requests, commands, but phrased politely enough to maintain the fiction of courtesy. Of course, Isolde replied, lead the way. They moved through corridors that felt more like fortifications than hallways. Minimal decoration, strategic sight lines, everything designed for defense and control. Servants moved through the space like ghosts, avoiding eye contact and speaking in whispers. This wasn't a household, it was an occupied territory. Captain Graves stopped before heavy wooden doors and knocked twice. Enter. The voice from inside carried weight that made even Graves hesitate fractionally before pushing the doors open. Isolde stepped into the study alone. The room was exactly what she expected. Maps covering every wall. Documents stacked with obsessive precision. No personal items, no comfort. Just information and calculation arranged into systematic warfare against chaos. Duke Cadric Ashford stood behind a desk near the window, his back to her, studying something on the surface before him. He didn't turn at her entrance, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. It was deliberate, a power move designed to establish hierarchy immediately. Isolde waited in silence, refusing to speak first or show discomfort at being ignored. Two could play dominance games. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then two. Finally, Cadric turned and looked at her directly. The reports hadn't prepared her for the reality. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s at most, hard features carved by stress and violence, gray eyes that assessed her with the same clinical focus she'd use examining a strategic problem. No warmth, no courtesy, just pure calculating attention. Lady Ravencroft, he said without inflection, the Crown sends its observer. Duke Ashford, thank you for receiving me. I didn't have a choice. Royal decree tends to limit options. You could have refused. And given the king justification to escalate tensions? No. Better to cooperate superficially while maintaining actual control. Isolde almost smiled. At least he was direct. I'm here to assess the humanitarian situation in the Northern Territories. The Crown has concerns about reports of excessive force and civil rights violations. Cadric walked slowly around his desk, each movement controlled and deliberate. The Crown has concerns. How diplomatic. What they actually want to know is whether I've become too dangerous to control, whether the cure has become worse than the disease, whether removing me is worth the chaos it would cause. That's certainly one interpretation. It's the only interpretation that matters. He stopped a few feet from her, maintaining just enough distance to avoid being threatening while ensuring she felt the full weight of his presence. So let me save us both time, Lady Ravencroft. I know why you're really here. You're intelligence gathering for a potential removal operation. You'll observe my methods, interview citizens, document violations, and report back whether assassination or political maneuvering is the more efficient approach to eliminating me. Isolde kept her expression neutral. You have quite an imagination. I have experience, and sources inside the palace who tell me everything I need to know. So instead of pretending this is humanitarian oversight, let's be honest. You're here to determine if I'm still useful or if I've become expendable. And if that were true, what would you do about it? Something dangerous flickered across Cadric's face. Not quite anger, more like acknowledgement of interesting prey. Nothing. Because you're going to discover very quickly that removing me creates problems far worse than tolerating me. The radicals tearing this kingdom apart don't care about humanitarian concerns or civil rights. They care about power. And the only thing stopping them from burning everything to ash is me. My methods, my ruthlessness, my willingness to do what everyone else lacks stomach for. So we should accept tyranny to prevent chaos? You should accept reality. Your choice is controlled brutality that maintains stability or uncontrolled brutality that destroys everything. There is no third option where everyone's happy and nobody suffers. That fantasy doesn't exist outside children's stories. Isolde held his gaze without flinching. And you've appointed yourself judge of what level of suffering is acceptable? Someone has to make that judgment. Someone always does. The difference is I'm honest about it instead of hiding behind moral justifications that mean nothing when cities burn. He turned away, moving back toward his desk with dismissive finality. Captain Graves will show you to your quarters. You'll have access to most facilities and permission to interview staff and citizens. Document whatever violations you want. File whatever reports make you feel useful. Just stay out of active military operations and don't interfere with security protocols. Clear? Perfectly. Isolde turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. One question, Duke Ashford. Do you actually believe what you're saying? Or is this just convenient philosophy to justify becoming exactly what you claim to fight? For the first time, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not anger, not defensiveness, something closer to exhaustion. It stopped mattering what I believed years ago. Now there's only what works and what doesn't. Everything else is irrelevant. Isolde left without responding, her mind already cataloging everything she'd observed. The man was brilliant, damaged, dangerous. Exactly the kind of threat that required careful handling. But there was something else beneath the brutality. Something broken that might still be accessible if she could find the right leverage point. She just had to stay alive long enough to exploit it. The Northern Territories revealed themselves slowly over the following days, like wounds that never fully healed. Isolde traveled through districts with military escort that made every citizen nervous by association. She interviewed families living under martial law, spoke with merchants whose businesses operated under constant surveillance, listened to stories of relatives disappeared for suspected sedition. Everyone was terrified, not of radicals, of their own duke. But something else emerged from the conversations that the reports from the capital hadn't captured. Beneath the fear lived grudging respect, recognition that before Ashford's brutal crackdown, things had been worse. Gangs controlling streets, corruption strangling commerce, violence erupting randomly without consequence. Cedric had brought order, just at the cost of everything resembling freedom. On the fourth night, Isolde compiled her observations in her private quarters while Thaddeus kept watch near the door. The evidence was damning. Unlawful detentions, summary executions, collective punishment policies. The Duke had crossed every line separating governance from dictatorship, yet removing him would create vacuum that radicals would fill immediately. The kingdom would collapse within months. The king had sent her to solve an impossible problem, condemn a tyrant, or preserve stability. Both options led to disaster. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Thaddeus opened the door cautiously. Captain Graves stood outside looking grim. Lady Ravencroft, the Duke requests your presence in the war chamber. Immediately. It's nearly midnight. I'm aware. He was insistent. Isolde exchanged glances with Thaddeus, then rose and followed Graves through darkened corridors. Something had changed. The normal military efficiency felt sharper tonight, more urgent. Soldiers moved through hallways with combat readiness. The war chamber doors stood open. Inside, Major Thorne and a dozen senior officers surrounded tables covered with maps and intelligence reports. Everyone looked exhausted, strained. Cedric stood at the center studying a large tactical display with absolute focus. He didn't look up as she entered. Lady Ravencroft, you wanted to understand my methods. Here's your opportunity. We have credible intelligence that radical cells are planning coordinated attacks across 5 major cities simultaneously. Estimated casualties in the thousands. The operation launches at dawn. Isolde moved closer, studying the maps. How reliable is this intelligence? Reliable enough? Multiple independent sources, intercepted communications, pattern analysis showing resource movements consistent with major offensive. And your response? Cedric finally looked at her. Preemptive strike. Hit their staging areas before they can deploy. Maximum force, no survivors. You're talking about raids on civilian districts. I'm talking about stopping massacres before they happen. Based on intelligence that could be wrong. Based on intelligence that's consistent with every other radical operation for the past 6 months. These people don't hide their intentions effectively. They rely on us being too squeamish to act preemptively. Major Thorne stepped forward carefully. Your Grace, Lady Ravencroft raises a valid concern. If the intelligence is incorrect, we'd be attacking innocent neighborhoods. The political consequences are irrelevant compared to preventing thousands of deaths, Cadric interrupted. We move at 0300, full tactical deployment. Anyone in the target zones gets detained for questioning. Anyone resists gets eliminated. Questions? Silence. Then Isolde spoke. I have a question. What happens if you're wrong? What happens if you raid these districts and find families instead of terrorists? What happens to your justification then? Kedric's expression didn't change. If I'm wrong, innocent people suffer briefly and survive. If I'm right and do nothing, innocent people die permanently. The mathematics favor action. That's not mathematics, that's gambling with other people's lives. Every command decision is gambling with lives. The difference is whether you accept that reality or pretend you can avoid it through inaction. He turned back to his officers, dismissing her objection entirely. Execute the plan as briefed. I want status reports every 15 minutes. Move. The room emptied rapidly as commanders rushed to implement orders. Within seconds, only Isolde and Cadric remained in the war chamber. She didn't leave, didn't back down. You can't do this. I can and I will. You'll start a war. War already started. I'm just the only one fighting it. Isolde moved directly into his line of sight, forcing confrontation. This isn't strategy. This is paranoia. You're so afraid of being weak that you've become exactly what you claim to prevent, a monster creating more monsters. Something flickered in his eyes, something almost like recognition. Then it vanished behind cold calculation. You should return to your quarters, Lady Ravencroft. What happens next isn't your concern. Mom, Dean. It is absolutely my concern. I'm here to report on your methods. This is exactly the kind of overreach the Crown can investigate afterward if it bothers them. Right now, people are going to die one way or another. I'm choosing which people. That's command. That's leadership. That's the burden everyone wants removed from their conscience but refuses to carry themselves. He walked past her toward the door. Isolde called after him. What happened to you? What made you like this? And Kedric stopped but didn't turn around. I watched people I loved die because I wasn't ruthless enough to save them. I learned that mercy is what you offer when you can afford consequences. And I learned that the only thing worse than becoming a monster is being too weak to prevent other monsters from winning. Then he was gone, leaving Isolde alone in the war chamber, surrounded by maps showing planned violence across territories filled with people who had no idea they were about to become statistics in someone else's tactical calculation. She stood there for long minutes, weighing options that all led to disaster. Then she made a decision that would either save lives or destroy everything. She was going to stop him. The assault force mobilized at 0200 with military precision that would have been impressive if it wasn't so terrifying. 300 soldiers in full combat gear loading into armored transports, while commanders shouted coordinates and status updates. Isolde watched from the armory entrance where she'd positioned herself after leaving the war chamber. She'd spent the past hour preparing, memorizing patrol routes, identifying communication hubs, calculating exactly how much interference she could create before getting killed or detained. Captain Graves approached from her left, his expression unreadable. Lady Ravencroft, you should be in your quarters. I'm observing military operations, part of my humanitarian assessment. This isn't observation territory. It's active combat deployment. Then consider me embedded press. Graves almost smiled. The Duke specifically ordered that you stay clear of operations. The Duke doesn't command me. I serve the Crown, not regional dictators. That got his attention. Calling Ashford a dictator in front of his officers was deliberately provocative. Graves stepped closer, lowering his voice. Ma'am, with respect, You don't understand what you're interfering with. These raids could prevent thousands of casualties. Whatever moral objections you have, the mathematics favor action. Everyone keeps talking about mathematics like it justifies anything. Math doesn't account for the families you're about to terrorize. The innocent people who'll die because your intelligence isn't as reliable as you think. And if the intelligence is correct, if we do nothing and cities burn tomorrow, then we respond to actual threats instead of potential ones. That's the difference between defense and aggression. Graves studied her with something between respect and pity. You're going to try to stop this, aren't you? I'm going to try to delay it long enough to verify intelligence before innocent people pay for the Duke's paranoia. That's treason. No, that's preventing war crimes. What? Before Graves could respond, engines roared as the transport convoy began moving toward the main gates. Soldiers jogged alongside in combat formation. Within minutes, the entire force would be deployed across target districts. Isolde moved fast. She ran toward the communications hub located in the East Tower, her mind calculating exactly how to create maximum disruption with minimum violence. Disable communications. Delay deployment. Buy time for someone rational to intervene before this spiraled into massacre. She reached the tower entrance and found it guarded by two young soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave. They stepped forward reflexively, weapons raised halfway. Ma'am, this area is restricted. Wush or mam do dards. I need to send urgent message to the capital. Crown priority. All communications are locked during active operations. Orders from... Isolde didn't wait for them to finish. She stepped past them with the kind of aristocratic confidence that made people forget she didn't actually have authority here. The soldiers hesitated just long enough. She was through the door and climbing stairs before they decided whether stopping her was worth potential consequences of manhandling a noble lady. The communication room at the top of the tower held 4 technicians monitoring equipment. They looked up in surprise as Isolde burst through the door, breathing hard. Who authorized? Crown priority, Isolde interrupted. I need to send coded message to King Julian immediately. The senior technician shook his head. All external communications are suspended during tactical operations. Duke's direct order. I'm countermanding that order under Crown authority. You can't countermand the Duke in his own territory. Watch me. She moved toward the equipment, but 2 of the technicians blocked her path. They weren't being aggressive, just confused and following protocols. Behind her, boots pounded up the stairs. The guards she'd bypassed were coming. Isolde made a split-second decision. She grabbed the nearest communication device and smashed it against the floor. Then the next one. Then started pulling cables from wall connections with desperate efficiency. Technicians shouted, tried to stop her, but they were hesitant to actually harm a Crown observer. That hesitation cost them 30 seconds. In 30 seconds, Isolde disabled enough equipment to cut communications across the entire compound. Then hands grabbed her arms roughly. Guards hauling her away from the destroyed equipment while technicians screamed about security breaches and sabotage. Isolde didn't resist. She'd accomplished what she needed. The deployment force couldn't coordinate effectively without communications. The raids would be delayed or called off entirely until systems came back online. She'd bought time, maybe enough to matter. The guards dragged her down the tower stairs and through corridors toward the detention cells. Other soldiers watched in shock as the Crown observer was hauled past like a common criminal. They threw her into a cell and slammed the door without ceremony. Isolde sat on the stone bench and waited, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She'd just committed treason against the kingdom's most dangerous commander. Either she'd prevented a massacre or guaranteed her own execution. Within 20 minutes, she got her answer. The cell door opened violently. Duke Cadric Ashford stood in the entrance, his expression colder than anything she'd seen before. Behind him, Captain Graves and Major Thorne waited with weapons drawn. Cadric stepped inside slowly, each movement controlled despite obvious rage radiating from him like heat. You sabotaged my operation. Isolde stood to face him directly. I prevented potential war crimes. You delayed response to credible terrorist threats. I delayed raids based on intelligence you can't verify. I can verify it just fine. What I can't verify is whether you're incompetent or actively working with the radicals to undermine security operations. That stopped her. You think I'm working with terrorists? My meat. I think you arrived here with Crown authority and immediately started interfering with counterterrorism efforts. I think you sabotaged communications during active combat deployment. I think your actions directly benefited the people planning to murder thousands of citizens tomorrow. So either you're a traitor or you're so ideologically blind that you can't tell the difference between protecting civilians and enabling their deaths. Isolde held his gaze without backing down. And you're so paranoid that you can't tell the difference between preventing attacks and creating new enemies through brutality. You're turning this entire region into powder keg and calling it security. Kadric moved closer until they were inches apart. His voice dropped to something quietly dangerous. I should execute you right now. Public hanging for treason and sabotage. Make an example that would terrify anyone else considering interference. Then do it. Prove you're exactly the monster everyone believes you are. Silence stretched between them, heavy with violence waiting to happen. Then Kadric stepped back, his expression shifting into something harder to read. No. Executing you creates diplomatic crisis I don't need right now, so instead you're confined to this cell until I can transfer you back to the capital with formal charges. The king can decide what to do with you. Guards will be posted outside. Escape attempts will be met with lethal force. Clear? Perfectly. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. You think you saved lives tonight. You didn't. You just delayed inevitable violence while giving radicals more time to prepare. Tomorrow, when cities burn and bodies stack in the streets, remember that your conscience demanded this outcome. And when innocent families are terrorized by your raids based on faulty intelligence, remember that your paranoia demanded that outcome. Something flashed across his face, not quite pain, more like recognition of truth he couldn't acknowledge. Then he left, slamming the cell door behind him with final brutal efficiency. Isolde sat back down on the stone bench, her body shaking with adrenaline aftermath. She'd bought time, disrupted operations, created enough chaos to maybe prevent immediate massacre, but she'd also made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the kingdom. And now she was trapped in his fortress with no communication, no allies, and no way to know if her actions would save anyone or just get her killed for nothing. Outside the cell, she heard soldiers moving, orders being shouted, systems being repaired. The raids would happen eventually, just delayed, reorganized, maybe more carefully planned because of her interference, or maybe more brutal because she'd made him look weak in front of his own command structure. Isolde closed her eyes and tried to calculate whether she'd made the right choice, but the mathematics of morality never added up cleanly. There were only decisions and consequences, and she just committed to both without knowing which side of history would judge her correctly. In the darkness of the cell, she heard distant thunder, or maybe explosions, or maybe just her imagination filling silence with expected disasters. She wouldn't know until morning whether she'd saved lives or gotten thousands of people killed through idealistic interference. All she knew was that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd declared war on Duke Kadric Ashford, and in his territory, under his control, surrounded by his soldiers, that declaration meant only one thing. She was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. Dawn broke with the kind of gray light that made everything look like it was already dying. Isolde had spent the night on cold stone listening to boots marching past her cell and wondering whether she'd actually prevented anything or just delayed her own execution. The answer came at 6 in the morning when explosions shattered the false quiet. Not distant thunder, not imagination. Real detonations tearing through the city in coordinated waves that rattled the fortress walls and sent soldiers sprinting through corridors shouting coordinates and casualty estimates. The radicals had attacked anyway, multiple targets simultaneously, exactly as Kadric's intelligence had predicted. Isolde stood frozen in her cell as the reality crashed over her like ice water. She'd sabotaged the preemptive strikes, delayed the response, given the terrorists extra hours to position and prepare. And now people were dying because of her moral certainty. The cell door opened violently. Captain Graves stood there with an expression that managed to convey both fury and something almost like pity. You need to see this. He didn't wait for response, just turned and walked. 2 guards flanked Isolde as she followed through corridors filled with organized chaos, officers shouting orders, medics preparing equipment. The entire fortress mobilizing for crisis response. They climbed stairs to the observation tower overlooking the city. Graves pointed toward the horizon where black smoke rose in thick columns against pale sky. 3 hospitals, 2 schools, 4 residential blocks, all hit within 20 minutes. Current casualty estimates are approaching 800 dead, mostly children and elderly. The radicals targeted the most vulnerable populations specifically to maximize psychological impact. Isolde felt her stomach drop. Dear God. God didn't do this. You did. The words hit like physical blows. Graves continued with the brutal precision. The Duke's preemptive strikes would have hit staging areas before dawn, would have caught terrorists before they could deploy, would have saved most of these people. But you sabotaged communications, delayed deployment, gave them the window they needed. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. You wanted to believe the Duke was paranoid, that his intelligence was wrong, that your moral superiority justified interfering. And now 800 people are dead because you valued feeling righteous over accepting ugly reality. Isolde stared at the smoke columns, her mind refusing to process the magnitude of what she'd enabled. She'd been so certain, so confident that preventing Kaedric's raids was the right choice, that protecting potential innocents mattered more than trusting brutal methods. But the innocents weren't potential anymore. They were corpses. Where's the Duke? She asked quietly. Leading response teams, pulling survivors from rubble, doing exactly what he said he'd do while you sat in your cell congratulating yourself on preventing war crimes. The observation was designed to hurt. It succeeded. Graves turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. For what it's worth, Lady Ravencroft, I don't think you're evil, just dangerously naive. You believed in principles that don't survive contact with reality. The Duke learned that lesson years ago. You just learned it now. Question is whether you'll accept it or keep pretending the world works the way you wish it did. Then he was gone, leaving Isolde alone with the view of a burning city and the crushing weight of unintended consequences. She stood there for unknown minutes, watching smoke rise and emergency bells ring and her certainty crumble into ash. Everything she'd believed about moral action and preventing brutality had just killed 800 people. And the man she'd called a monster had been right all along. Kaedric returned to the fortress 12 hours later, covered in ash and blood and exhaustion so profound it looked like physical injury. He walked through the main hall without acknowledging anyone, his boots leaving dark prints on marble floors. Isolde watched from the gallery above, her guards allowing her limited movement now that immediate crisis had passed. She'd spent the day hearing casualty reports, listening to survivor accounts, understanding exactly how catastrophically she'd miscalculated. The attacks had been surgical, coordinated, designed for maximum civilian death with minimal military engagement, exactly the kind of terrorism that Kaedric's brutal methods were supposed to prevent. And she'd stopped him. She descended the stairs slowly, moving against the flow of officers and medics still responding to ongoing emergencies. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody even looked at her. She'd become invisible through complicity, the observer who'd interfered so catastrophically that she barely registered as human anymore. She found Kaedric in his private quarters, standing at the window staring at nothing. He hadn't changed clothes, hadn't cleaned the blood from his hands, just stopped moving like a machine that finally ran out of fuel. Isolde knocked on the open door frame. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. I was wrong, she said quietly. Silence. Your intelligence was correct. The preemptive strikes would have saved lives. I prevented that. 800 people died because of my interference. I accept responsibility. More silence. Then Kaedric spoke without moving, his voice empty of everything except exhaustion. You think I want your confession? Your acceptance of responsibility? What exactly does that accomplish? Does it resurrect the dead? Does it comfort families bearing children? Does it change anything except making you feel slightly better about catastrophic failure? No. Then why are you here? Because you were right about everything. And I need to understand how you live with that, how you make these decisions knowing that being right means being hated, how you carry the weight of necessary evil without it destroying you. Kaedric finally turned, and what Isolde saw in his face made her breath catch. Not anger, not satisfaction at being vindicated, just hollow emptiness where human emotion used to exist. You don't carry it, he said flatly. You just stop feeling it. You build walls so high that guilt can't reach you anymore. You convince yourself that mathematics of survival justify anything, that being hated is acceptable cost of being effective, and eventually you realize you're not pretending anymore. You've actually become the monster everyone believes you are. That's not true, isn't it? I sent soldiers into districts knowing innocent people would suffer. I executed suspects without trials because trials take time and time costs lives. I built a police state because stability requires fear. And I did all of it without hesitation or remorse because hesitation gets people killed. So tell me, Lady Ravencroft, what's the functional difference between being a monster and acting like one so consistently that the distinction becomes meaningless? Isolde had no answer. So, Isolde. Cedric turned back to the window. You should return to the capital, file your report. Tell the king that Duke Ashford has become exactly what everyone feared. A tyrant who rules through brutality and calls it necessity. Recommend my removal. Suggest whatever political solution makes everyone feel better about tolerating me this long. Just do it away from here because I can't have your conscience interfering with actual crisis management. I'm not leaving. That got his attention. He looked at her with something between surprise and irritation. That wasn't a request. I know, but I'm not leaving until I understand how to fix this, how to prevent the next attack. How to actually help instead of making everything worse through idealistic interference. You can't help. You're a liability, an observer with authority to interfere but no capability to handle consequences. The best thing you can do is leave before you enable more deaths. Isolde stepped further into the room, refusing to be dismissed. Then teach me. Show me how your methods work. Let me see the intelligence, the decision-making, the actual calculations instead of just the brutal results. If I'm going to report on you accurately, I need to understand the context you operate in. Cedric studied her with clinical focus, weighing options with visible calculation. Finally, he spoke. You'll see things that will disgust you, methods that violate everything you believe about human rights and dignity, and you won't be allowed to interfere. You'll observe and document, but you'll follow orders without question. Those are the terms. Agreed. And if you sabotage anything again, I'll have you executed immediately. Royal observer or not. The crown can sort out diplomatic consequences after you're dead. Clear? Perfectly clear. Something shifted in the air between them. Not quite trust. More like mutual acknowledgement of necessary alliance despite fundamental opposition. Cedric gestured toward the door. Then you'll start now. We have prisoners from the staging areas who survived the attacks. They're being interrogated in the detention complex. You wanted to see my methods. Here's your opportunity. Isolde followed him through corridors that grew progressively darker as they descended beneath the fortress. The air got colder. The sounds from above faded until only dripping water and distant screaming remained. They reached a heavy door guarded by 2 soldiers who saluted and stepped aside without speaking. Inside, Major Thorne stood over a man chained to a chair in the center of a stone room. The prisoner's face was bloodied, his clothes torn. His eyes held the kind of wild terror that came from knowing death was approaching and having no idea when it would arrive. Thorne looked up as they entered. Your Grace, Lady Ravencroft, we're in the middle of enhanced interrogation. Cedric moved to stand beside the prisoner, studying him with detached interest. What has he told you so far? Names of 3 other cell members, locations of 2 safe houses, description of the coordinator he never met directly. And the next planned attack? Claims he doesn't know. I believe him. These cells operate independently. Nobody knows the full network. Cedric nodded slowly. Then he pulled a knife from his belt and held it casually, letting light reflect off the blade. The prisoner's breathing accelerated instantly. Isolde felt her stomach tighten but forced herself to remain still, to observe without interfering as she'd promised. Cedric spoke quietly, almost gently. You're going to tell me everything you know about organizational structure, how cells communicate, how coordinators recruit, how funding moves. Every detail, no matter how insignificant. And you're going to do it quickly, because my patience for terrorists died somewhere around the 4th dead child I pulled from hospital rubble this morning. The prisoner spat blood. I already told him everything. I don't know anything else. Then you'll repeat what you already said and hope that repetition reveals details you forgot the first time. Because the alternative is that I start removing pieces of you until pain makes memory work better. You can't. Kadric moved fast. The knife flashed. The prisoner screamed as his left ear hit the floor in a spray of blood. Isolde jerked reflexively but stopped herself from interfering. This was what she'd demanded to see. The actual methodology beneath the statistics and reports. This was how stability got maintained, through calculated brutality that made terrorism more painful than the cause justified. The prisoner was sobbing now, blood streaming down his neck. Please, please, I told you everything. Then tell me again, in more detail, with better specificity, and hope that your memory improves before I lose interest in your survival. For the next 20 minutes, Kadric systematically extracted information through methodology that Isolde had only read about in sanitized intelligence reports. He never raised his voice, never showed emotion, just applied precise escalating pain until the prisoner provided every detail his shattered mind could access. By the end, they had operational intelligence that would prevent at least 2 planned attacks and identify 3 more cell members. The prisoner lay unconscious in his own blood, still breathing, but barely. Kadric wiped his knife clean and returned it to his belt with casual efficiency. Then he turned to Isolde. Well, is this what you expected when you demanded to understand my methods? Isolde swallowed hard. No. Disappointing, too brutal, not noble enough for your humanitarian sensibilities? Effective, she said quietly. I expected brutality. I didn't expect it to be this calculated, this precise, this obviously productive. Something flickered across Kadric's face. Not quite respect. Maybe recognition that she was actually trying to understand instead of just judge. Enhanced interrogation works, he said flatly. Not always, not perfectly, but it produces actionable intelligence faster than any alternative. The price is that you have to become someone capable of inflicting this level of suffering without hesitation. Most people can't pay that price. They convince themselves that methods matter more than results, that maintaining moral purity justifies accepting preventable deaths. And you paid that price. I stopped seeing it as a price, started seeing it as currency, suffering exchanged for survival, individual rights sacrificed for collective security. The mathematics work as long as you don't care about who you become in the process. He walked past her toward the door, then paused. There are 6 more prisoners waiting for interrogation. You're welcome to observe them all, document every violation, compile your evidence of war crimes and human rights abuses. Just remember that every piece of intelligence we extract prevents deaths that would otherwise happen. So when you're writing your reports condemning my methods, make sure you include the casualty statistics from attacks we stopped. Let the king decide whether 800 confirmed dead is worth preventing 8,000 potential dead through means that make everyone uncomfortable. Then he was gone, leaving Isolde alone in the interrogation room with Major Thorne and the unconscious prisoner, and the overwhelming realization that morality was infinitely more complicated than she'd ever acknowledged. Thorne gestured toward the door. We'll be starting the next interrogation in 20 minutes if you'd like to observe. Isolde nodded slowly, her mind struggling to process what she'd witnessed. Slowly, she'd crossed into territory where comfortable principles dissolved into brutal necessity, where the choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between different magnitudes of evil. And the most terrifying part was that she was starting to understand why Kadric had stopped caring which choice destroyed his humanity. Because in this world, humanity was just another luxury that got people killed. Mom. 3 days of interrogations produced enough intelligence to prevent 4 planned attacks and dismantle 17 radical cells across the Northern Territories. The methods used to extract that intelligence would have violated every convention of warfare and human rights that civilization had spent centuries establishing. Isolde documented all of it with cold precision. Every torture technique, every psychological manipulation, every moment where a human being was reduced to meat and pain until information spilled out alongside blood. And she documented the results, the lives saved, the attacks prevented, the stability maintained through systematic brutality that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone depended on. On the 4th night, Kadric summoned her to his study. She found him standing at his tactical table studying maps marked with red circles indicating neutralized threats. He looked marginally less exhausted than before, but no less hollow. "Your observation period is complete," he said without preamble. "You have enough evidence to condemn me thoroughly. Captain Graves will escort you to the capital tomorrow. You'll present your findings to the king and recommend whatever action your conscience demands. And if I recommend your removal, boy, all abdurishfads. Then the king will deliberate for approximately 6 weeks while political factions argue about succession and power distribution. During that time, radical cells will reorganize and launch new attacks targeting the resulting chaos. Casualties will likely exceed 5,000 before anyone establishes control. But at least everyone will feel good about maintaining moral standards." Isolde moved to stand across the table from him. "You're not actually worried about being removed, are you? You're preparing for it, planning how to manage succession and minimize damage even while being eliminated." "Of course. Contingency planning is basic strategic thinking. I've had removal scenarios prepared since the first execution. The question was never if, but when my usefulness would expire." "That's a remarkably calm attitude toward your own political death." Kadric looked up from the maps, his gray eyes reflecting lamplight like polished stone. "I stopped fearing consequences years ago. Fear is what weak men feel when they can't control outcomes. I accepted long ago that this position has expiration date. I'm just trying to delay it until someone competent enough to replace me actually exists. And if that person never materializes, then the kingdom collapses, and everyone learns exactly what necessary evils we're preventing. Humanity gets very educational when civilization fails." Isolde studied him carefully. 4 days of observation had revealed something the reports never captured. Kadric wasn't sadistic, wasn't cruel for pleasure. He'd systematically destroyed his own humanity to build a machine capable of survival calculations that other people couldn't stomach. He'd become exactly what the kingdom needed and everyone hated. A functional monster maintaining order through methods that made order possible. "I'm not recommending your removal," she said quietly. That finally got a visible reaction, surprise flickering across his face before control reasserted itself. "Why not? You have overwhelming evidence of violations." Or do what? "Because removing you creates worse problems than tolerating you, and because someone needs to understand the difference between barbarism and necessary evil. You're not a tyrant drunk on power. You're a casualty of position that requires inhuman choices from human beings. That's remarkably philosophical from someone who sabotaged military operations 4 days ago." "I was wrong 4 days ago. I've adjusted my assessment based on new evidence. That's called learning instead of dogma." Kadric moved around the table slowly, studying her with renewed attention. "So what exactly will you recommend to the king?" "That you remain in command with increased oversight. The crown observers get embedded in security operations. That enhanced interrogation requires approval from multiple authorities. That we acknowledge your methods work while implementing safeguards against abuse. Bureaucratic compromise. How predictable. Practical management of impossible situation. How necessary." Something almost like respect crossed his face. "You've changed, Lady Ravencroft. 4 days ago you were idealistic observer convinced of moral superiority. Now you're proposing frameworks that legitimize torture as long as committees approve it." "Oh, I'm proposing frameworks that acknowledge reality while maintaining some ethical boundaries. It's not perfect. It's just less catastrophic than the alternatives." "Less catastrophic," Kadric repeated slowly. "That's the best we can hope for. Not good. Not right. Just less terrible than other options. Welcome to governance." He almost smiled. The expression looked foreign on his face, like muscles that had forgotten the movement. Then the door burst open violently. Captain Graves stood in the entrance. Graves stood, his face showing the first genuine fear Isolde had seen from him. "Your Grace, we have a situation. Major priority." Kadric's expression shifted instantly back to combat readiness. "Report." "Major Thorne is missing. Last seen 3 hours ago heading toward the detention complex. He didn't check in for scheduled updates. When we investigated, we found 2 guards dead, and all enhanced interrogation files missing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Missing how? Kedrick asked with dangerous quiet. Gone. Taken. All physical copies and our only backup drive. Everything we extracted over the past 4 days. Every name, every location, every operational detail about radical networks. Isolde felt ice spreading through her chest. Someone accessed your intelligence. Not just accessed, Graves continued grimly. Major Thorne's quarters were searched thoroughly. We found encrypted communications equipment and coded messages dating back 8 months. He was feeding information to radical coordinators the entire time. Every interrogation we conducted, every cell we neutralized, every operation we planned. He reported all of it. Silence crashed down like physical weight. Then Kedrick moved to his weapons cabinet with mechanical precision, started pulling out knives, firearms, tactical gear. His hands moved fast but steady, no wasted motion. How long until radical cells know we're compromised? They likely already know. Thorne probably transmitted immediately when he realized Lady Ravencroft was documenting methods. He'd know that exposure was imminent. Casualty estimates if they use our intelligence against us? Graves swallowed hard. Conservative estimate? Thousands. They know our patrol routes, our response protocols, our fortress layouts. They know exactly where we're vulnerable. Kedrick finished arming himself and turned toward them both. His expression had shifted into something beyond cold calculation, something ancient and merciless that lived beneath even his brutal professionalism. Lock down the fortress, mobilize every combat unit, activate emergency protocols across all territories, and find Major Thorne before he reaches Radical headquarters. I want him alive enough to understand exactly what his betrayal cost. Graves saluted and disappeared. Isolde stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of disaster. The Duke's most trusted officer, his intelligence chief, the man coordinating their entire counterterrorism effort, a traitor embedded at the highest level for months. Kedrick looked at her with something between grim satisfaction and exhausted recognition. Still think oversight and committees can manage this? Still think there's ethical framework that accounts for systematic betrayal by people you trust most? Isolde had no answer, because every framework she'd proposed had just collapsed into ash alongside the illusion of controlled brutality. There was no control. There was only chaos managed temporarily by men willing to become monsters. And sometimes even monsters discovered that evil was more creative than their worst calculations. Kedrick moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. You wanted to understand my methods. Now you'll see the final lesson. What happens when necessary evil realizes it wasn't ruthless enough? When the price of maintaining humanity becomes extinction? When the only choice left is complete destruction of everything you tried to protect or total transformation into something worse than what you fought? What are you going to do? His smile was terrible to witness, empty of everything except purpose refined into weapon. I'm going to hunt down everyone connected to this betrayal and erase them so thoroughly that future terrorists will tell stories about what happens when you betray Kedrick Ashford. I'm going to burn every radical safe house, execute every coordinator, eliminate every sympathizer until the very concept of opposing me becomes historical cautionary tale instead of viable option. That's genocide. That's survival. And when you write your report condemning it, make sure you explain the alternative. Make sure the king understands that I'm not choosing cruelty. I'm choosing existence. And if existence requires becoming the worst thing humanity can imagine, then that's the price I'll pay. Because the only thing worse than being a monster is being too weak to stop other monsters from winning. Then he was gone, moving through corridors with deadly purpose, while alarms began wailing across the fortress. Isolde stood alone in the study, surrounded by maps of territories about to become battlegrounds, and the crushing realization that she'd never understood anything at all. She'd thought brutality was the problem. She'd thought oversight could manage darkness. She'd thought human systems could control inhuman necessities. But darkness didn't need oversight. It needed commitment, total, absolute commitment to methods so terrible that even thinking about them required abandoning everything civilization claimed to value. And Kedrick had just crossed the final line separating calculated ruthlessness from extermination campaign. She'd asked to understand his methods. She'd demanded to see reality beneath comfortable illusions. She'd insisted that moral certainty was more important than accepting ugly necessity. And now she was going to watch what happened when necessary evil realized it had been too merciful all along. When the monster stopped pretending to be human and finally became the catastrophe everyone always feared. When survival required transformation so complete that the man she'd met days ago would cease to exist entirely, replaced by something infinitely worse, infinitely more effective, and infinitely more terrifying. The kingdom wanted protection from chaos. It wanted stability maintained through acceptable means. It wanted violence controlled by ethics and brutality tempered by oversight. But chaos didn't care what the kingdom wanted. Betrayal didn't respect ethical frameworks, and evil didn't limit itself to acceptable means. So Cedric Ashford was about to teach everyone the final lesson in necessary evil, the one truth that civilization spent centuries denying, the reality that made comfortable people uncomfortable and idealistic observers complicit in catastrophe. Sometimes the only way to save something was to destroy everything it stood for in the process. Sometimes protection required becoming worse than the threat. Sometimes the hero had to die completely so the monster could finally do what survival demanded. And Isolde was going to document every moment of that transformation while understanding with perfect terrible clarity that she'd helped create it. That her interference and her idealism and her moral certainty had pushed him past the final boundary where humanity ended and extinction protocol began. She'd wanted to understand necessary evil. Now she would witness its ultimate form and learn whether civilization could survive being saved by methods that made survival itself questionable. The alarms kept wailing, soldiers kept mobilizing, and somewhere in the darkness, a betrayed duke was becoming something that would make his previous brutality look like compassion by comparison. The kingdom had created Cedric Ashford to solve problems it couldn't stomach. Now it was going to discover what happened when the solution became more terrifying than the original threat. When necessary, evil stopped being necessary and became simply evil. When the last wall fell and the monster they'd built to protect them finally turned around and showed them what monsters actually look like when every restraint gets burned away. And there was nothing anyone could do except watch, document, and pray that whatever emerged from this crucible would still remember why it started protecting people in the first place, before it forgot entirely and just started destroying everything instead. The hunt began at midnight with the kind of cold precision that separated professional soldiers from angry mobs seeking revenge. Cedric stood in the fortress courtyard watching 300 men gear up for extermination protocol while winter wind carried the scent of coming snow and violence. This wasn't a raid, wasn't even a military operation in the traditional sense. This was erasure. Complete systematic elimination of every person, place, and organization connected to Major Thorne's betrayal. No prisoners, no interrogations, no intelligence gathering. Just removal of threats so absolute that future generations would excavate mass graves and wonder what kind of catastrophe required this level of brutality. Captain Graves approached with final status reports. All units ready. We have confirmed locations for 17 safe houses, 8 coordination centers, and approximately 400 individuals with direct connections to radical networks. Rules of engagement? Cedric's voice was empty of everything except purpose. Kill everyone. Burn everything. Leave nothing that can be rebuilt or remembered fondly. I want these organizations erased so thoroughly that even sympathizers forget they existed. Graves nodded slowly. He'd served under Cedric long enough to recognize when orders crossed from ruthless into apocalyptic. Your Grace, that level of violence will create political crisis. The crown will demand explanations. Other noble houses will shut their mouths and be grateful I'm directing this fury at radicals instead of the infrastructure that enabled Thorne's betrayal for 8 months. Now execute the orders or step aside for someone who will. Graves saluted and moved to relay commands. Isolde emerged from the fortress entrance wrapped in a thick coat against the cold. She'd armed herself with documentation equipment, pens and paper, and the grim determination of someone who understood they were about to witness history written in blood. Cedric noticed her approach but didn't acknowledge it directly. Just kept watching his soldiers prepare with the detached focus of a man who'd already decided how tonight would end. You're actually going through with this, Isolde said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes. This isn't counterterrorism. This is genocide. This is cauterization. Removing infected tissue before sepsis kills the entire organism. The methodology is brutal because half measures already failed. Thorn proved that mercy creates vulnerability. So mercy stops now. And what happens to you when this is finished? When you've murdered hundreds of people and can't hide behind strategic necessity anymore? Kadric finally looked at her. His expression held something beyond emptiness, something like recognition that he was walking toward a cliff edge and choosing to jump anyway because standing still meant watching everything collapse. I stop existing as anything except a weapon. The man you met last week dies tonight. What replaces him is whatever this kingdom needs to survive. If that's a monster, then I become a monster. If that's an executioner, then I become that. I stopped caring about personal identity. Somewhere around the moment my most trusted officer turned out to be coordinating the people who murdered 800 civilians. That's not strategic thinking. That's suicide. No. Suicide is giving up. This is choosing which version of death serves a purpose. I can die slowly, losing myself piece by piece while pretending there's an ethical way to handle systematic betrayal. Or I can die fast and completely while ensuring that betrayal gets punished so severely that no one ever attempts it again. The second death at least accomplishes something. He turned toward his waiting horse, then paused and looked back. You should stay here. Document from reports and survivor accounts. What happens tonight isn't something observers need to witness firsthand. I'm coming. Why? You've already compiled enough evidence to condemn me. You don't need more. Because someone needs to remember what you were before this. Someone needs to document the moment you stopped being human and started being legend. And because if I'm complicit in creating this through my interference, I need to watch what I helped build. Kadric studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and mounted his horse. The assault force moved out in tactical formation through gates that opened onto darkness absolute. Behind them, the fortress stood illuminated against night sky like a monument to power that no longer bothered pretending to be civilized. Ahead lay the districts where radicals had built networks thinking they understood what ruthlessness looked like, thinking they could match brutality with ideology and terror with righteousness. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were, about to discover that monsters weren't born from cruelty or sadism or love of violence. Monsters were born from necessity, refined until everything except survival calculations got burned away. And the most dangerous monsters were the ones who remembered exactly what they were sacrificing and chose destruction anyway, because the alternative was extinction. The convoy rolled through empty streets while citizens watched from windows with expressions mixing fear and something almost like relief. They knew what was coming, knew that blood would flow tonight in quantities that would stain cobblestones for years. But they also knew that the blood wouldn't be theirs, that Kadric's fury was directed elsewhere with laser focus that spared collateral damage while obliterating actual targets. That was the terrible brilliance of his methods. He didn't terrorize randomly, didn't inspire fear through chaos. He inspired it through precision, through demonstrating that if you became his enemy, death arrived with mathematical certainty regardless of where you hid or how carefully you planned. The first safe house appeared ahead, a 3-story residential building in a working-class district, no different from surrounding structures except for subtle signs that trained eyes recognized. Reinforced doors, unusual foot traffic, communication equipment visible through curtained windows. Kadric raised his hand. The convoy stopped instantly. Soldiers dismounted in practiced silence and surrounded the building with movements so synchronized they looked choreographed. No shouting, no warnings. Just tactical positioning that sealed every exit before anyone inside realized they were trapped. Then Kadric gave a single sharp gesture. Doors exploded inward. Windows shattered. Soldiers poured through breaches with weapons raised and orders shouted in harsh military cadence. Gunfire erupted immediately. Muzzle flashes strobing through darkness like violent lightning. Screaming, shouting. The compressed chaos of close-quarters combat where survival got measured in split-second reactions. It lasted 90 seconds. Then silence crashed down as soldiers emerged dragging bodies into the street. 17 corpses. 3 wounded radicals who wouldn't survive long enough to receive medical attention. 0 survivors capable of reporting what happened. Kadric dismounted and walked through the carnage with clinical focus, checking faces against intelligence photos, confirming kills, ensuring no one slipped through gaps in the tactical net. Isolde watched from her position near the convoy's rear, her hands shaking as she documented everything. the precision, the efficiency, the complete absence of hesitation or mercy. This wasn't soldiers fighting enemies. This was exterminators removing vermin with the same emotional investment someone might feel crushing insects. Captain Graves approached Kadrick with a data slate. Confirmed kills match predicted occupancy. We recovered communications equipment and operational files. No intelligence suggesting they transmitted warnings before we hit them. Good. Burn the building. Move to the next target. Sir, there are families in adjacent structures. The fire will spread. Then evacuate them first. I'm erasing organizations, not neighborhoods. Execute the order. Within minutes, flames consumed the safe house while soldiers herded confused residents away from the inferno. They didn't explain, didn't apologize, just moved people to safety with mechanical efficiency and then remounted for the next location. The night became a series of rapid, brutal assaults against targets that never saw death approaching until it was already inside their walls. Safe houses burned. Coordination centers collapsed under explosive charges. Radicals died in their beds or at their tables or running through streets toward escape routes that had been sealed hours earlier through intelligence Thorne had provided before his betrayal. The irony was perfect. Thorne's own reports about radical infrastructure were now being used to systematically erase everything he'd tried to protect. Every location he'd documented became a kill site. Every name he'd collected became a target. His betrayal had given Kadrick the complete blueprint for total organizational destruction. And Kadrick was following that blueprint with the methodical precision of a man who'd stopped caring about anything except completion. By 3 a.m, the assault force had eliminated 14 locations and approximately 200 individuals. The casualty count would have been catastrophic in conventional warfare. In this context, it was just progress toward final solution. Isolde had stopped documenting specific details hours ago. Now she just watched with numb horror as the man she'd met days earlier systematically transformed into something that would haunt stories for generations. The Iron Duke becoming legend. The necessary evil becoming simply evil. The last restraints burning away as survival calculations consumed everything resembling humanity. They reached the 18th target just before dawn. A warehouse complex on the industrial district's edge that intelligence identified as the primary coordination center for the entire radical network. Major Thorne's encrypted communications suggested this was where strategic decisions got made and major operations planned. Eliminating it would decapitate the remaining organizational structure completely. Kadrick deployed his forces with extra caution here. More soldiers, heavier weapons, overlapping fields of fire. He knew this target would be defended more aggressively than the others, knew that whoever ran operations from inside would be experienced and dangerous. What he didn't know was that Major Thorne was waiting inside with 40 armed radicals and a plan that had been brewing since the moment he realized his cover was blown. The assault began identically to the previous raids. Breached doors, shattered windows, soldiers pouring through entry points. Then machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions with devastating accuracy. The first wave of soldiers went down instantly, bodies crumpling in doorways and window frames while muzzle flashes lit the warehouse interior like strobe lights in hell. Kadrick reacted with combat instincts honed through years of battlefield command, shouting orders, redirecting forces, calling for heavy weapons and tactical adjustments while gunfire tore through the pre-dawn darkness. But this wasn't a safe house full of amateur revolutionaries. This was a prepared defensive position held by people who knew exactly how the Duke operated and had planned accordingly. The battle devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Soldiers fighting through warehouse corridors while radicals defended every meter with suicidal determination. Explosions shook the structure's foundations. Smoke filled enclosed spaces until visibility dropped to arm's length. Men died screaming in darkness while their comrades stepped over corpses to press forward. Isolde huddled behind an armored transport watching the warehouse transform into an abattoir. She'd wanted to observe, to document, to understand what necessary evil looked like when constraints disappeared. Now she understood. And the knowledge was almost worse than ignorance, because necessary evil looked like good men dying for causes that made sense from opposing perspectives. Looked like violence so overwhelming that individual deaths stopped registering as tragedy and became simply mathematics. Looked like the complete systematic destruction of everything civilization claimed to value in service of civilization's survival. Captain Graves took a round through the shoulder and kept fighting. Young soldiers barely old enough to shave died clutching weapons they'd barely learned to use. The warehouse filled with smoke and blood, and the screaming of wounded men who knew help wasn't coming fast enough. And through it all, Kadric advanced with terrifying focus, moving through chaos like he was born in it, killing with precision that suggested he'd stopped seeing enemies as human and started seeing them as obstacles requiring removal. He fought his way to the warehouse's central office, where Major Thorne waited behind an improvised barricade with a pistol and the kind of calm that came from accepting inevitable death. They faced each other across a room filled with tactical maps and operational documents. Two men who'd trusted each other completely, who'd built counterterrorism infrastructure together, who'd shared countless strategic sessions calculating how to prevent massacres and maintain stability. Now they were just enemies separated by ideology and 15 feet of blood-stained concrete. Thorne spoke first, his voice steady despite the gunfire still echoing through the warehouse. "You should have seen this coming. Should have realized that brutality creates enemies faster than it eliminates them." Kadric aimed his weapon with mechanical precision. "I saw it coming. Just didn't think you were stupid enough to believe in causes that require murdering children. Didn't think 8 months of working together meant nothing against revolutionary fantasy. 8 months of watching you become exactly what we're fighting against. A tyrant who justifies anything through necessity. A monster who forgot there are lines you don't cross, regardless of circumstances. Lines are luxuries, ideal in realities. And the reality is that your ideology killed 800 people last week, while my brutality was busy preventing it. So don't lecture me about morality when your hands are covered in innocent blood." Amashkit. At least I believe in something beyond survival. At least I'm fighting for actual change instead of maintaining systems that grind people into poverty and desperation. Kadric's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire yet. Didn't grant the quick death that mercy might have offered. Instead, he asked the question that had been burning since discovering the betrayal. Why? Why betray everything we built? Why enable the massacres you knew would happen? Thorne smiled bitterly. Because watching you operate showed me exactly what the kingdom would become if your methods won. A police state where everyone lives in fear, where stability requires permanent brutality, where survival means accepting that some people have to suffer so others can feel safe. That's not a kingdom worth preserving. That's a prison. And I'd rather burn it down and rebuild from ashes than watch you perfect the machinery of oppression. Noble speech. Doesn't change the fact that you're a traitor who enabled mass murder. And you're a tyrant who enables systemic violence. The difference is, I'm honest about what I am. You're still pretending to be a protector. Something in Kadric's expression shifted. Not quite pain, more like acknowledgement of truth that couldn't be refuted. You're right. I stopped being a protector years ago. Stopped being anything except a weapon pointed at problems that normal people couldn't solve. And maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe I've become exactly what you claim. But here's the difference between us, Thorne. I accept what I've become. Own it completely. While you hide behind ideology, pretending that burning children alive is somehow noble if the cause is righteous enough. Better to die believing in something than live believing in nothing. Then die. The gunshot was loud in the enclosed space, final and absolute. Major Thorne collapsed backward with a hole through his chest and an expression of grim satisfaction, like he'd proven a point even while losing the argument permanently. Kadric stood over the body for a long moment, his weapon still raised, his breathing harsh in the smoke-filled air. Around him, the sounds of combat were fading as his soldiers finished eliminating the last defensive positions. He'd won. Destroyed the radical network completely, eliminated the organizational infrastructure so thoroughly that rebuilding would take years, demonstrated to every potential enemy that betraying Duke Ashford ended in total annihilation. But victory felt like ash in his mouth, like he'd crossed a line so far beyond redemption that coming back was no longer an option, even if he wanted to. He holstered his weapon and walked out of the office without looking back, without acknowledging the corpses scattered throughout the warehouse, without showing any recognition that he'd just ordered and executed mass killing that would define his legacy forever. Outside, dawn was breaking across the industrial district, pink and gold light painting smoke columns rising from burning buildings. The assault force was regrouping, counting casualties, loading wounded into transport vehicles while medics worked frantically to stabilize critical injuries. Captain Graves approached with his wounded shoulder bandaged hastily. Your Grace, final count is 47 enemy dead, 18 of ours killed, 26 wounded. The coordination center is destroyed. All intelligence files recovered or burned. Kadric nodded slowly. And Major Thorne? Dead, confirmed visual. Good. Gather his remains. I want them displayed publicly as an example of what betrayal costs. Graves hesitated fractionally. Displaying corpses violated several conventions, but he'd stopped expecting the Duke to care about conventions hours ago. Yes, sir. Isolde emerged from her position behind the transport, looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her clothes were covered in dust and ash. Her hands shook as she tried to write notes that kept becoming illegible scrawls. She walked toward Kadric with unsteady steps and stopped a few feet away, staring at him like he was something from nightmare that had crossed into waking reality. Are you satisfied? She asked quietly. Is this what victory looks like? Kadric looked at the burning warehouse, at the bodies being loaded into transport vehicles, at the dawn light revealing the full magnitude of overnight carnage. Satisfaction is irrelevant. This is what survival looks like when betrayal removes the possibility of restraint. This is what happens when necessary evil realizes it wasn't evil enough. You've become exactly what Thorne accused you of being, a monster who justifies anything, a tyrant drunk on power and violence. Yes, and that monster just saved this kingdom from systematic terrorism that would have killed thousands more. So when you write your report condemning me, make sure you include that detail. Make sure the king understands that this level of brutality prevented worse outcomes, that sometimes the only way to stop monsters is to become something more terrifying than what you're fighting. He moved past her toward his horse, exhaustion finally showing in the heaviness of his movements. Then Captain Graves shouted from the warehouse entrance, Your Grace, we have a problem! Kadric turned sharply, combat readiness snapping back instantly despite exhaustion. Graves emerged carrying a data slate with an expression of absolute horror. Sir, we found Thorne's final transmission. He sent it the moment our assault began. A complete intelligence package including every detail about our fortress defenses, our patrol routes, our supply lines, our command structure, everything. Cold dread settled in Kadric's chest. Sent to who? Multiple radical cells we didn't know existed. Backup organizations Thorne never told us about. They're positioned throughout the kingdom with enough coordination to launch simultaneous attacks on critical infrastructure. Timeline? Unknown, could be hours, could be days, but they have everything they need to cripple our entire security apparatus. Silence crashed down as the implications settled over everyone present. Kadric had won the immediate battle, destroyed the visible organizational structure, eliminated hundreds of enemies. But Thorne's betrayal extended far deeper than anyone realized. The information he'd leaked would enable attacks that made last week's hospital bombings look minor, would create chaos that the depleted security forces couldn't possibly contain. The kingdom was about to discover that killing the monster wasn't enough, that the real nightmare began when the monster's death activated contingencies designed for exactly this scenario. Isolde stared at the data slate in Graves's hands, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. He knew you'd come for him, knew you'd destroy everything, so he made sure that destroying him would destroy you too. Made sure that winning would feel exactly like losing. Kadric stood motionless, his mind calculating probabilities and outcomes with the mechanical focus that had sustained him through every previous crisis. But the calculations kept arriving at the same conclusion. He didn't have enough soldiers, didn't have enough intelligence, didn't have enough time or resources or capability to prevent what was coming. He'd spent everything destroying Thorne's network, and Thorne had spent his death ensuring that victory was meaningless. For the first time in years, Kadric felt something that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, but for the kingdom he'd sacrificed everything to protect. The civilization he'd become a monster to preserve. And now that civilization was about to burn anyway because monsters, no matter how necessary or effective, were still just monsters. Still vulnerable to being outplayed by smarter enemies. Still capable of losing despite winning every immediate battle. Still human enough to fail when failure meant extinction. Graves waited for orders that didn't come. Soldiers watched their commander for leadership that seemed to have frozen. And dawnlight kept spreading across the industrial district, painting smoke and blood and the corpses of necessary evil in shades of gold that made everything look almost beautiful, almost redeemed. But beauty was just another illusion that died when reality came to collect. And reality was approaching fast with teeth bared and revenge planned and the absolute certainty that Duke Cadric Ashford, for all his brilliance and brutality and ruthless calculation, had finally encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through violence alone. The kingdom needed something more than a monster now. Needed innovation and adaptation and strategies that hadn't been tried because they required the kind of humanity he'd systematically destroyed to become effective. And he was standing in the ruins of his greatest victory, realizing with perfect, terrible clarity that he'd built himself into a weapon so specialized that it had become useless against threats requiring different solutions. The Iron Duke was about to learn whether iron could bend before breaking, whether monsters could evolve, or if evolution required starting over with raw material that still remembered how to be human. Whether survival was actually possible when the only tool you had was a hammer and the problem required surgical precision, and whether the woman standing beside him documenting his transformation into legend had witnessed the birth of something terrifying or just the death throes of something that never should have existed in the first place. The answers would come soon. They always did, usually written in blood and fire, and the screaming of innocents who never asked to become collateral damage in wars fought by people who'd forgotten why protection mattered more than victory. But for now, in the dawn light of the industrial district, surrounded by corpses and smoke and the ashes of his most complete triumph, Cadric Ashford stood perfectly still and felt the weight of everything he'd destroyed to reach this moment, and wondered if the kingdom would survive long enough for him to discover whether he'd saved it or just delayed its death while perfecting the methodology of its execution. The fortress felt different when they returned. Not physically changed, just hollow, in a way that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with understanding that walls couldn't protect against information already leaked. That stone and steel meant nothing when your enemies knew exactly where every weakness lived. Caedric stood in his war chamber surrounded by maps that suddenly felt obsolete. Every defensive position marked, every patrol route documented, every strategic advantage negated by intelligence that Major Thorne had transmitted in his final moments. The room that had represented absolute control now represented absolute vulnerability. And the irony was almost beautiful in its brutality. He'd spent years building infrastructure designed to prevent exactly this scenario, had eliminated threats preemptively, had ruled through fear calculated to make resistance suicidal, had become the monster everyone needed because monsters were supposed to be invincible. But monsters weren't invincible. They were just good at hiding vulnerability behind brutality. And now, his vulnerability was broadcast to every enemy cell in the kingdom with detailed instructions on how to exploit it. Captain Graves entered carrying updated intelligence reports. His wounded shoulder was properly bandaged now, but he moved like a man who'd aged decades overnight. Your Grace, we've identified at least 23 separate radical cells that received Thorne's transmission. They're positioned throughout the kingdom, some in territories we never suspected of harboring resistance. They have everything: fortress layouts, command protocols, supply chain vulnerabilities, personal schedules for every senior officer. Kedrick absorbed the information without visible reaction. Timeline for coordinated attack? Unknown. Could be imminent. Could be weeks while they prepare. Intelligence suggests they're waiting for optimal moment when our forces are most depleted and scattered. Usoski Mosas, which would be now, after we've spent every reserve conducting overnight extermination operations. Yes, sir, Itukwam. Caedric turned toward the window overlooking territories that suddenly felt like enemy country despite years of brutal pacification. Everything he'd built, every system he'd implemented, every fear he'd carefully cultivated. All of it rendered meaningless by one man's betrayal and the information that betrayal had released. Power wasn't permanent, control was illusion. And monsters discovered eventually that the real nightmare was waking up and realizing you'd sacrificed everything to build something that could collapse overnight. Recall all deployed units. Consolidate forces at the fortress. Abandon outlying patrol stations and focus everything on central defense. If they want to attack, let them come here where we have maximum tactical advantage despite compromised intelligence. Graves hesitated. Sir, abandoning patrol stations leaves civilian districts unprotected. Radical cells could... Could do exactly what they'll do, whether we spread thin trying to protect everywhere or concentrate forces to protect something. I'm choosing to protect the command infrastructure that coordinates kingdom-wide security. Individual districts will have to manage until we neutralize this threat completely. That's condemning people to die without protection. That's accepting reality that I can't protect everyone simultaneously, so I'm protecting the capacity to protect people long-term, even if it means short-term casualties. It's still mathematics, just uglier mathematics than before. Graves looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he saluted and left to implement orders that would likely get innocent people killed while preserving institutional capability. The kind of choice that had defined Kadric's entire command. The kind of calculation that had transformed him from idealistic officer into necessary monster. The kind of decision that seemed straightforward until you had to live with consequences. Isolde appeared in the doorway looking exhausted beyond measure. She'd spent the journey back documenting everything in precise detail. Every casualty, every burned building, every moment of transformation as the Duke had methodically destroyed his own humanity to eliminate organizational threats. Now she stood there holding papers covered in observations that would condemn him thoroughly, while understanding with terrible clarity that condemnation changed nothing about necessity. "You're pulling back from civilian districts," she said flatly. "Yes. People will die. Yes. And you're accepting that. I'm accepting that I can't prevent it. That spreading forces thin enough to protect everyone means protecting no one effectively. That concentration of defensive capability matters more than symbolic presence in areas we can't actually secure. So yes, I'm accepting that people will die because the alternative is that more people die, plus we lose the capacity to respond to future threats. Still mathematics. Still brutal. Still the only option that makes strategic sense." Isolde moved into the room slowly, her papers clutched in shaking hands. When does it end? The calculations, the sacrifices, the systematic destruction of everything decent in service of survival. When do you look around and realize you've saved nothing worth preserving? Kadric turned from the window to face her directly. For the first time since they'd met, his expression showed something beyond cold calculation, something that looked almost like pain. It doesn't end. That's what no one tells you about becoming a monster. You think there's a finish line, a moment where you've done enough brutal things and can finally rest. But there isn't. There's just the next crisis, the next impossible choice, the next piece of yourself that has to be sacrificed to keep the machinery running. And eventually you realize that the person you were before doesn't exist anymore, that you've traded humanity for effectiveness so completely that going back isn't possible even if you wanted to. So you just keep destroying everything until nothing remains? I keep functioning until I can't anymore. Until someone more effective replaces me, or until the kingdom collapses despite my efforts. Those are the only two endings this story has. There's no redemption arc. No moment where I'm forgiven and welcomed back into civilized society. I crossed those lines years ago. Now I'm just trying to delay catastrophe long enough for someone better to emerge and actually solve problems, instead of just managing them through brutality. But Isolde stared at him with expression mixing horror and something that looked almost like understanding. You actually believe that? You've convinced yourself that you're a temporary evil, a placeholder until real solutions arrive. I don't believe anything. I just accept reality. And reality says that kingdoms require monsters during certain eras, that sometimes civilization needs people willing to do inhuman things so humanity can continue existing. I'm not proud of that role. I'm just grimly aware that refusing it would have resulted in worse outcomes. And what about Major Thorn? Was he just accepting reality too? Making calculations that justified murdering innocents for ideological causes? That landed like a physical blow. Kadric's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Thorn was a traitor who enabled mass murder. The difference between us is that my brutality prevents deaths, while his enabled them. That's the line separating necessary evil from actual evil. Results. Outcomes. The mathematics of who survives and who doesn't. You keep calling it mathematics like that makes it cleaner, like reducing human lives to numbers somehow justifies the calculations. But 800 people died last week because I interfered with your mathematics. And now you're about to let more people die because your mathematics says protection isn't strategically optimal. So tell me, Duke Ashford, when do the numbers stop mattering and the actual human costs start registering? Kaedric was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and pulled out a leather journal, opened it to reveal pages covered in handwritten names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every person who died because of my decisions. Every civilian casualty from operations I ordered. Every suspect who turned out to be innocent after interrogation. Every collateral death from raids and strikes and tactical choices. I document them all. Write their names if I can find them. Note the circumstances, the reasoning, the outcomes. He held the journal out toward Isolde. This is what the human cost looks like. This is me registering every single death. Not because it changes anything, not because it brings anyone back, but because someone needs to remember that the mathematics represents actual people with actual lives that got ended for strategic purposes. So don't assume I've stopped being human enough to care. I just care in ways that don't interfere with functioning. Isolde took the journal with trembling hands, opened it to random pages, and saw names written in precise handwriting. Dates. Ages when known. Brief notes about circumstances. Marcus Thorne, age 14. Killed during raid on suspected safe house. Intelligence was incorrect. He was just a kid in the wrong building. Sarah Wendell, age 67. Died of heart attack during evacuation. My soldiers scared her to death trying to save her life. The entries went on for hundreds of pages. A catalog of collateral damage documented with obsessive precision by a man who refused to let himself forget what his effectiveness cost. Isolde looked up at Kaedric with tears streaming down her face. This doesn't change anything. It doesn't make the deaths acceptable or justified. I know, but it makes them real. Makes them individual instead of statistical. And maybe that's all morality means at this level. Refusing to let brutality become so normalized that you stop registering human cost. I'm still a monster. Just a monster who remembers being human and documents what that memory cost. Before Isolde could respond, alarms began wailing throughout the fortress. The sharp, urgent sound that meant imminent threat detected. Incoming attack. All personnel to defensive positions. Kaedric's expression shifted instantly back to combat readiness. He moved toward the War Chamber's command center where tactical displays were lighting up with threat indicators. Captain Graves burst through the door seconds later. Your Grace, multiple simultaneous attacks across the kingdom. They're hitting everything at once. Supply depots, communication hubs, administrative centers. It's coordinated down to the second. Casualties? Unknown. Early reports suggest massive destruction, but limited targeting of civilians. They're going after infrastructure instead of people. Kaedric studied the tactical displays with focused intensity. His mind was already calculating responses and countermeasures despite exhaustion and emotional weight. Then something on this display caught his attention, made him stop and look closer with expression shifting from tactical focus to dawning horror. They're not targeting the fortress. Graves blinked. Sir? Look at the attack pattern. They're hitting everything we need to maintain control except our actual defensive position. They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to make us irrelevant, to destroy our capability to project power while leaving us trapped inside our own walls, watching the kingdom burn. Isolde moved beside him and studied the displays, saw what he meant immediately. Every target was chosen to cripple long-term capability while avoiding direct confrontation that would cost radical lives. It was brilliant, viciously brilliant. Thorne's final gift to his cause. Not just intelligence about fortress defenses, but strategic insight about how to neutralize the Duke without fighting him directly. Kaedric stood frozen as the implications crashed over him. He'd spent overnight conducting extermination operations, had killed hundreds, had crossed every remaining line between ruthless and monstrous, had transformed completely into the weapon everyone needed. And now that weapon was being systematically disarmed, not through defeating it, but by removing everything it was designed to protect. The fortress would stand. He would survive. His soldiers would remain operational, but the kingdom infrastructure they protected would be ash. The civilians they kept safe would be vulnerable. The stability they maintained through fear would collapse into chaos that made previous radical attacks look insignificant. He'd won every tactical engagement and lost the strategic war completely. because monsters were only useful when they had something to protect. When threat of their brutality maintained order. When their reputation prevented attacks through demonstrated willingness to inflict overwhelming retaliation. But once the infrastructure collapsed, and civilians were already dying and stability had disintegrated, what purpose did monsters serve except standing in ruins, wondering how effectiveness had become meaningless? Kaedric's hands gripped the edge of the tactical display hard enough that his knuckles went white. His breathing was harsh in the sudden silence as alarms continued wailing and displays kept updating with new attack confirmations. Isolde watched his face as understanding settled, watched the calculated brutality dissolve into something rawer, more desperate, almost human. "What do we do?" Graves asked quietly. Kaedric was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke with voice stripped of everything except exhausted recognition of checkmate. "We evacuate the fortress, deploy every available soldier to civilian districts, abandon central defense, and spread out to protect people directly. Stop trying to maintain institutional power and start actually helping the individuals we claim to serve." Graves looked stunned. "Sir, that violates every strategic principle. Spreading forces thin when enemy intelligence is superior, abandoning defensive advantage, prioritizing individuals over institutional capability. It's tactically suicidal." "I know. But tactics are what got us here. Tactics and calculations and brutal effectiveness that optimized everything except what actually mattered. So maybe it's time to try something stupidly idealistic, like actually protecting people, instead of protecting the systems designed to protect people. Maybe the monster needs to stop being a monster and remember why protection mattered in the first place." He turned toward Isolde, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Because, for the first time since she'd met him, Duke Kaedric Ashford looked genuinely afraid. Not of death or defeat, but of the possibility that he'd wasted years becoming something inhuman for purposes that had always been built on flawed premises. "You were right," he said quietly. "About everything. I became exactly what everyone feared. Built machinery of oppression and called it security. Sacrificed humanity for effectiveness and called it necessity. And now I'm standing in the ruins of that choice, realizing that effectiveness means nothing if the things I was trying to protect are gone anyway." "So what changed?" Isolde asked. "What made you suddenly care about individuals after years of mathematical optimization?" Thorn's final move. He didn't just leak intelligence. He forced me to confront that I've been optimizing for the wrong variables. I thought power mattered, control mattered, fear mattered. But those were just means. The actual purpose was keeping people safe. And somewhere in the process of becoming effective enough to maintain control, I forgot that protecting systems isn't the same as protecting people. He looked at the tactical displays showing coordinated destruction across the kingdom, at the infrastructure collapsing despite his best efforts, at the evidence that years of brutal effectiveness had been strategically outplayed by enemies who understood him better than he understood himself. So now I'm making a different calculation, one that probably gets me killed but might actually matter. I'm going to take every soldier in this fortress and deploy them to protect civilians directly. No central command, no institutional preservation, just boots on the ground helping people survive chaos. And if that means the Duke's power collapses and regional warlords take over and everything I built crumbles, then at least it crumbles while actually serving the purpose it was supposedly designed for. Lords. Captain Graves looked like he'd been struck. "Your Grace, that's not a tactical decision. That's suicide." "No. Suicide is continuing to optimize for variables that don't matter while the kingdom burns. This is acknowledging that I was wrong about what effectiveness means. That maybe the monster doesn't need to be more monstrous. Maybe it just needs to remember being human long enough to do one decent thing before everything ends." He moved toward the door with sudden decisive energy, started shouting orders to officers who appeared confused by the strategic reversal, demanded immediate deployment to civilian districts, ordered defensive abandonment that violated every principle of military science, and slowly, watching their commander transform from calculating monster into something desperate and almost noble, the soldiers began moving to comply. Because there was something in Kaedric's voice that hadn't existed before, something that sounded less like orders and more like plea from a man who'd finally recognized that winning meant nothing if you lost yourself completely in the process. Isolde followed him through corridors filled with organized chaos as the fortress mobilized for evacuation. She'd spent days documenting his transformation into necessary evil. Now she was watching transformation in opposite direction. Monster remembering humanity. Weapon choosing to become shield instead of sword. She caught up with him at the armory where he was personally distributing weapons and supplies to soldiers preparing for deployment. "You know this probably won't work," she said. "That spreading thin against superior intelligence is exactly how you lose wars." Kedrick handed ammunition to a young soldier and looked at Isolde with expression mixing exhaustion and something that looked almost like peace. "I know, but I've spent years winning wars while losing everything that made winning worthwhile. So maybe it's time to try losing the war while actually protecting what wars are supposed to be fought for. Maybe effectiveness isn't the only metric that matters. Maybe sometimes you have to choose between being strategically optimal and being actually decent. And maybe I've optimized for the wrong thing long enough that decent is worth trying, even if it gets me killed." Wa Isham. That's not calculation talking, that's guilt. Maybe, but guilt might be the only human emotion I have left that hasn't been sacrificed to necessity. So I'm following it while it still exists, while I can still feel something beyond cold mathematics and brutal optimization. Because if I wait until I'm certain this is the right strategic move, I'll never make it. And I'll die knowing I was effective right up until I was irrelevant. He moved past her toward the courtyard where soldiers were mounting horses and loading into transport vehicles. The fortress that had represented absolute power was transforming into launching point for distributed aid mission that violated every principle of centralized control. And somehow, watching Kaedric coordinate the evacuation with the same focused intensity he'd applied to extermination operations, Isolde realized she was witnessing something rare. Not redemption exactly, not atonement or forgiveness, just recognition. A monster looking in mirror and choosing to be something different, even if different meant death. The deployment took 2 hours. 300 soldiers dispersing across territories marked by burning infrastructure and collapsing systems. No central coordination, no unified command. Just individual units moving towards civilians who needed protection regardless of strategic implications. Kaedric led the largest contingent personally, rode at the front of column heading toward districts where radical attacks had created maximum chaos, where families were trapped in burning buildings and children were separated from parents, and the entire social fabric was dissolving into panic. Isolde rode beside him, her documentation equipment abandoned in favor of medical supplies. Because at some point during the past few days, she'd stopped being observer and started being participant. Stopped documenting transformation and started experiencing it alongside the man she'd come to condemn. They reached the first disaster zone at midday, a residential district where supply depot explosion had created firestorm consuming entire blocks. Civilians ran through smoke-filled streets screaming for help that wasn't coming because security forces were concentrated at the fortress following now obsolete strategic doctrine. Kaedric dismounted before his horse fully stopped and started shouting orders that had nothing to do with tactical positioning and everything to do with saving lives. Soldiers spread out, pulling people from buildings, establishing evacuation routes, creating fire breaks, working not as military units but as emergency responders who happened to have weapons. And something shifted in how civilians reacted. They'd feared the Duke's soldiers for years, avoided them, seen them as oppressors maintaining order through threat of violence. But now those same soldiers were carrying children through flames and helping elderly evacuate and risking their lives for people they'd previously treated as security problems requiring management. Kaedric worked alongside his soldiers without rank distinction, hauled debris, kicked down doors, pulled unconscious victims from smoke-filled rooms. His uniform became covered in ash and blood. His hands blistered from heat. His face showed exhaustion so complete that he looked like he might collapse at any moment. But he kept moving, kept functioning, kept choosing individual human survival over strategic positioning. And slowly, watching him work, Isolde understood what was actually happening. This wasn't tactical adjustment. This was penance. A man who'd become monster trying to remember what being human felt like before the memory disappeared completely. Trying to save people not because it served strategic purpose, but because saving people was supposed to be the entire point all along. They worked for 6 hours pulling survivors from disaster zone, saved maybe 300 people, lost count of how many they couldn't reach in time, watched buildings collapse with families still trapped inside, heard screaming that would haunt dreams for years. And through it all, Kaedric kept moving with mechanical determination that looked less like military discipline and more like desperate need to prove that effectiveness could mean something other than calculated brutality. When the immediate crisis stabilized, he finally stopped moving. Just stood in the middle of ash-covered streets surrounded by survivors and soldiers and the ruins of infrastructure he'd spent years trying to protect through methods that had proven catastrophically insufficient. Captain Graves approached with updated reports. "Your Grace, we've received word from other deployed units. Similar situations across the kingdom. They're focusing on rescue and evacuation instead of pursuing attackers. Casualties are high, but they're managing to save significant populations. And the fortress? Abandoned as ordered. Minimal garrison maintaining security. All intelligence indicates radical cells are moving to occupy it once they realize we've evacuated." "Oh?" Kaedric nodded slowly. The fortress that had represented his power. The stronghold that made him untouchable. About to be occupied by enemies who'd strategically outmaneuvered him completely. And somehow he couldn't bring himself to care, because standing in the street watching families reunite, and children being treated for injuries and people surviving, because soldiers had chosen protection over position, made the loss of institutional power feel almost irrelevant. Maybe this was what defeat looked like when defeat meant something. Maybe losing wars mattered less than saving lives within those wars. Maybe effectiveness wasn't about maintaining control, but about remembering why control had seemed important in the first place. Isolde moved beside him and spoke quietly. "You're going to lose everything, the fortress, your position, probably your life once the Crown realizes you've abandoned Central Command to play hero in disaster zones. I know. And you're at peace with that?" Kaedric looked at her with expression stripped of everything except exhausted honesty. "No, but I'm accepting it, because the alternative is maintaining power while watching from fortress walls as the kingdom burns. And I've done that calculation already. Optimized for wrong variables, become exactly what I needed to become to be effective. And now I'm standing in the ruins of that effectiveness, realizing that I'd rather die trying to be decent than live being optimal." That's not very strategic. No, but it's human. And humanity is what I sacrificed first to become necessary evil. So maybe reclaiming it for however long I have left matters more than surviving another decade as monster. Everyone tolerates because the alternative seems worse. He turned toward his soldiers who were establishing temporary shelter for survivors. Young men and women who'd served under his brutal command, now working with gentle efficiency to help civilians who'd previously feared them. And watching them transform from instruments of oppression into actual protectors, Kaedric felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not quite pride, not quite redemption. Just recognition that maybe effectiveness had always required this. That maybe the real necessary evil was having compassion in situations that seemed to demand brutality. That maybe being human in inhuman circumstances was the actual strategic advantage he'd been missing all along. "I need to write something," he said suddenly. Turned toward Isolde with urgent focus. "Your documentation, your reports. I need you to add one final entry." "What kind of entry?" "Acknowledgement that Duke Kaedric Ashford spent years becoming a monster to protect a kingdom. That he justified brutality through necessity and effectiveness through mathematics. That he was wrong. Not about threats being real. Not about violence sometimes being required. But about thinking that optimization and calculation and systematic ruthlessness were sufficient responses to complex human problems. That sometimes the most effective strategy is refusing to optimize, refusing to calculate, refusing to sacrifice humanity even when sacrifice seems strategically justified. But Isolde stared at him with something between shock and recognition. "You want me to document your admission of failure. I want you to document my admission of understanding, that the monster was never necessary, just convenient, easier than trying harder methods that required remaining human. That I took the brutal path because it was straightforward and measurable and didn't require wrestling with ambiguity. And that path led here, to this moment, where everything I built is collapsing because I optimized for wrong things. And what should I say you learned? Kaedric was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke with voice carrying weight of years spent becoming something terrible and the exhaustion of finally letting that transformation end. That power without compassion is just violence with better organization. That control without care is just oppression with strategic justification. That monsters aren't made by circumstances or necessity or impossible choices. They're made by people who stop trying to be better because being brutal is easier and more effective in the short term. And that the real necessary evil isn't becoming a monster. It's fighting like hell to stay human, even when everything suggests that humanity is a luxury you can't afford. Isolde pulled out her journal with shaking hands and started writing, documenting the final transformation. Not of man into monster, but of monster. Recognizing humanity still existed beneath brutality if you had courage to reclaim it. And Kaedric watched her write, while around them the kingdom burned and soldiers worked and civilians survived because someone had finally chosen protection over power. Because the Duke had finally remembered that the entire point of being strong was lifting others up instead of crushing them down. Because sometimes losing everything meant gaining back the only thing that had ever actually mattered, his humanity, battered and scarred and barely recognizable after years of systematic destruction. But still there, still possible to rebuild if he survived long enough to try. The sky above the disaster zone was darkening toward evening. Smoke painted sunset in shades of orange and crimson that made everything look like it was already burning. But beneath that sky, in the ruins of his strategic effectiveness, Kaedric Ashford stood among people he'd saved and felt something that had been absent for years. Not peace exactly. Not redemption or forgiveness or resolution, just possibility. The chance that maybe monsters could remember being human. That maybe necessary evils could choose to become unnecessary. That maybe the man he'd been before the brutality started still existed somewhere beneath all the calculated violence and could be recovered if he fought for it. And fighting for recovery seemed infinitely more worthwhile than fighting for power. Seemed like the kind of battle that actually mattered regardless of whether he won or lost. Because at least it was battle for something human instead of battle to maintain systems of control that had never been worth the price he'd paid to build them. So he stood in the evening light and chose a different future. One where Duke Kaedric Ashford stopped being the Iron Duke, stopped being necessary evil, stopped being monster everyone tolerated, and started being just a man who'd made terrible choices trying to fix them while he still had time. Who'd learned too late that effectiveness without humanity was just a longer road to the same destruction. Who discovered that the real strength wasn't in being feared, but in being present when people needed protection that didn't come with cost of their freedom. The kingdom would judge him harshly. History would remember the brutality more than the final transformation. Enemies would use his abandonment of power to seize territories and start new wars. But standing there in the ruins, watching soldiers help civilians, and knowing that hundreds of people were alive because he'd chosen differently, Kaedric found he could live with that judgment, could accept that sometimes the best outcome was personal destruction in service of decent action, that sometimes losing strategically meant winning in ways that actually mattered. The fortress was gone. His reputation would collapse. The crown would likely execute him for desertion or incompetence or violation of every strategic principle. But tonight, in this district, 300 people would sleep safely, because soldiers had chosen protection over position. And tomorrow those soldiers would make the same choice in different districts. And eventually, maybe the kingdom would learn that protection didn't require monsters, just required people willing to help without demanding control in exchange. That was the lesson. The final understanding that came too late to save his career, but maybe soon enough to save something more important. His recognition of what actually mattered when all the strategies and calculations and brutal effectiveness got stripped away. People. Just people. Surviving. Helping each other. Building something decent from ruins of whatever came before. And if Kaedric Ashford could contribute to that building even marginally, could make amends for years of optimized brutality by spending his final days actually protecting instead of controlling, could transform from necessary evil into unnecessary good even briefly, then maybe the monster could die knowing that the man had finally remembered why protection mattered more than power. Why compassion was more strategic than fear. Why being human in inhuman circumstances was the real battlefield where victories actually counted. The stars were emerging in darkening sky, sharp and clear against smoke, eternal witnesses to human drama playing out beneath them. And Kadric looked up at those stars and felt weight lifting that he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. The weight of being monster, of being weapon, of being necessary evil that justified anything through effectiveness. That weight dissolved into evening air as he stood among people he'd saved and soldiers who'd chosen decency and the woman who'd documented his transformation from both directions. And for the first time in years that felt almost like forever, Duke Kadric Ashford smiled. Not with calculation or strategy or brutal satisfaction, just with exhausted recognition that maybe he'd finally learned something worth knowing. That monsters were made by choices, and could be unmade by different choices. And that the real courage wasn't in becoming terrible to face terrible things. It was in staying human despite everything suggesting that humanity was weakness. He was human again. Barely. Damaged almost beyond recognition. But human enough to try rebuilding. Human enough to choose protection without control. Human enough to accept that losing power meant gaining back the only thing that made power worth having in the first place. The ability to care, to help, to protect without requiring submission, to be strong enough to be gentle, to remember that civilization wasn't built by monsters, no matter how necessary they seemed. It was built by people who refused to become monsters, even when circumstances made brutality look like wisdom. That was his legacy now. Not the Iron Duke, not the necessary evil, not the monster who maintained order through calculated brutality. Just a man who learned too late, but still learned. Who changed when change was hard. Who chose differently when different seemed suicidal. Who became human again by refusing to let effectiveness be the only metric that mattered. And somehow, standing in ruins, watching sunset paint smoke in colors that made destruction look almost beautiful, that legacy felt infinitely more valuable than anything he'd built through years of optimization. Because buildings could be rebuilt, systems could be restored, infrastructure could be repaired. But humanity once destroyed took lifetimes to recover, and he'd spent his lifetime destroying it. Now he'd spend whatever time remained recovering fragments, proving that even monsters could remember being human if they tried hard enough. That even necessary evils could choose to become unnecessarily good. That was enough. Had to be enough. Was all he had left to offer, and maybe offering it freely without strategic calculation or brutal effectiveness or mathematical optimization was exactly what the kingdom needed. What he needed. What humanity required from people who'd forgotten how to be human while learning how to be effective. The night deepened. Soldiers kept working. Civilians kept surviving. And Kadric Ashford stood among them, not as duke or commander or monster, but as man who'd finally learned that the real battle was always against his own capacity for brutality. That the real enemy was always the part of himself that justified inhumanity through necessity. That the real victory was choosing compassion when calculation suggested brutality was optimal. He'd lost the war, won the battle, saved 300 people, destroyed his own power, and somehow felt more at peace than years of victory had ever provided. Because this defeat meant something. This loss served purpose. This ending was actually beginning. New chapter, different story, same man but transformed by finally understanding what transformation actually required. Not becoming more brutal, becoming more human, not being stronger, being gentler, not calculating better, caring more. That was the revolution, the real strategy, the actual necessary action that changed everything. And he discovered it in ruins of effectiveness that had never been sufficient, in collapse of systems that had never been solutions, in destruction of power that had never been protection. And now, standing in evening light with ash in his lungs, and exhaustion in his bones, and humanity barely recovered from years of systematic destruction, Kadric Ashford chose a different future. One where monsters could die, where necessary evils could end, where brutality gave way to decency, not because decency was strategic, but because being human was the only battle worth winning. That was his resolution, his final transformation, his ending that was really beginning, and whatever came next. Whether execution or exile or just quiet death in service of protection instead of power, he would face it as man instead of monster, as human instead of weapon, as someone who'd learned that the real courage was vulnerability. The real strength was compassion. The real victory was choosing to be decent when everything suggested that decency was weakness and monsters were necessary and brutality was effective. He knew better now, had learned through pain and loss and recognition that came too late to save everything, but soon enough to save something, and that something was himself, his humanity, his capacity for care beneath years of calculated cruelty, his recognition that people mattered more than systems and compassion mattered more than control, and being human mattered more than being effective. That was enough, would always be enough. Was everything that actually mattered when power and strategy and brutal effectiveness got stripped away to reveal what had always been true beneath optimization and calculation and necessary evil. That humans needed other humans. That protection meant presence. That strength meant gentleness. That monsters were optional, no matter how necessary they seemed. That effectiveness without humanity was just longer path to destruction. That sometimes the real victory was losing strategically while winning ethically. That choosing decency over optimization was the most radical act possible in a world that valued power over people. And Cedric Ashford, standing in ruins of his own effectiveness, watching soldiers save lives instead of maintain control, finally understood what years of brutality had obscured. That he'd always had choice. That monsters were made not by circumstances but by decisions. That becoming necessary evil had never been necessary. Just easier than remaining human while facing inhuman challenges. He'd taken the easy path, the brutal path, the path of calculated effectiveness and systematic ruthlessness, and it had led here, to this moment, where everything collapsed and he finally saw what should have been obvious all along, that the real battle was always internal. The real enemy was always his own capacity for inhumanity. The real victory was always choosing to stay human when being monstrous seemed strategically justified. So he chose. Finally, after years of optimization, after decades of brutality, after a lifetime of becoming exactly what everyone feared, he chose differently, chose humanity over effectiveness, chose compassion over control, chose to be man instead of monster regardless of strategic implications. And standing there in evening light with people he'd saved surrounding him and future uncertain but chosen freely for first time in years, Cedric Ashford felt something that had been absent so long he'd forgotten the sensation. Not quite hope, not quite peace, just recognition that maybe monsters could die, that maybe men could live, that maybe the real necessary evil was refusing to become evil even when necessity seemed to demand it. That was his legacy, his lesson, his final gift to kingdom that had created him and feared him and ultimately taught him that sometimes the bravest thing was not being strong enough to destroy threats, but being strong enough to remain gentle despite threats. Strong enough to care despite danger. Strong enough to be human when being monster seemed necessary. That strength had eluded him for years. Now, in ruins of his power, he'd finally claimed it. Finally understood it. Finally lived it. And whatever came next, he would face it as man who'd learned that humanity was never luxury, never weakness, never optional strategic consideration. Humanity was everything, the entire point. The only thing worth protecting, even if protection cost everything else. Especially if it cost everything else. Because losing power while gaining humanity was trade that actually mattered, victory that counted. Ending that was really beginning. And he was ready for it, finally. After years of being weapon and monster and necessary evil. Ready to just be human, flawed and gentle and present. Ready to protect without controlling, to care without calculating, to be decent without demanding effectiveness. That was enough. Would always be enough. Was everything that had ever actually mattered. He just hadn't known it until standing in ruins of calculated brutality finally taught him what years of victory never could. That sometimes you had to lose everything to discover what was actually worth keeping, and what was worth keeping was humanity. Always humanity. Forever humanity. The only thing that separated protection from oppression. Care from control, love from possession. And he would spend whatever time remained proving it, living it, being human instead of being necessary. That was his resolution, his ending, his beginning, and it was enough.